All right, good morning, everyone. We have started recording the session and we'll go ahead and kick things off. As you saw in the schedule, we have kind of an opening remarks, soft opening each day before the official session starts. And you should be seeing a screen share of my slides. Let me know if you can't see it. My name is Zach Adam, and along with Jennifer Glass and all of our workshop organizers, welcome. There she is. We are getting started with our Nano to Cosmic Studies of Complex Systems virtual workshop, which is being run through the NASA PCE3 RCN, Research Coordination Network. And our overall purpose, before we get started, we'll run through some meeting logistics. If you need help at any point, either as a participant or as a speaker, reach out to Mike Toyon or Marco Bolt. They will be available today. And Mike will be with us throughout the meeting, but Marco is available just for today. They can help you work through any processes, any problems you're having. Harassment and keeping a neutral atmosphere is really important for us. So if you witness anything that seems like, an abuse of the process or of the space, contact Donald Burke Aguero. He is designated as our point of contact, and his email is provided on the workshop page. Days 1 and 2, we have invited speakers and discussion leads. And day 3 is dedicated just to synthesis and debate. It's free form. It may be 5 minutes long. It may be 5 hours long. It will be as long as we feel it needs to be as a group. You will be receiving links to shared meeting documents early on in the process, probably as the first session gets underway. And we'll be talking about this as we go along, but basically these are going to be the deliverables that come from this workshop. And we imagine all of these things being completed in about January of 2023. So this is really a kickoff event to learn about what's been going on over the last couple of years in this field and in this area, and how it might apply to prebiotic chemistry experimentation. You're going to hear all about this in the days ahead. Our purpose today really is to learn about new discoveries and ongoing challenges in studying systems level settings and laboratory experiments. Really, and we got started with this because what sets NASA-funded Origins research apart is that NASA by default has the biggest view on the universe. If you imagine what is a complex system, and we can debate what complexity means, and we will. We can debate what is interesting about it, but basically NASA by default has to study the largest complex system that we know of, the universe. And all NASA missions, when they look out and they're taking in all of the photon energy and the particle energy that's coming in and assessing what's going on in our universe, they don't really have the luxury of looking at any particular spot and kind of ignoring everything else. They really take everything in. And I realize that missions cost money, there's resources, and there's debates about how we allocate resources. But at the end of the day, all of the information coming in across all of the spectrum is useful for reconstructing what's going on in the universe. And a common theme for prebiotic chemistry is that, we might be asking ourselves, something chemically happens in a box. Is it genuinely complex or is it merely complicated? And the sense of scale is less important here than what's going on inside and how we assess it and how we determine what's going on. And so this might be an individual flask in a laboratory. It might be at the planetary scale. It might be at the scale of a planetary system or of a star. But at the end of the day, even zooming out on these, we might be interested in tiny subsets within that volume and what's going on. It really doesn't matter how we frame the question. It matters how we frame our experiments and our thoughts for characterizing, what complex is or what it means, or whether it's just a lot of different components that are interacting with each other. It's just very difficult to figure out. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. With NASA's conventional mission implementation, this is kind of just a really top-level diagram about how these different pieces of information and knowledge bases interact with one another. But basically, NASA is designing missions and implementing missions to try to figure out how to characterize a complex system, like a planet or a star system or the universe. And basically, within this envelope, complex systems theory applies in any number of these steps. And so we're going to be dedicating this workshop just to talking about what complex systems are and developments in this kind of area that's adjacent to prebiotic chemistry and what its relevance to designing and implementing prebiotic chemical experiments might be. So our focus in this workshop will be on the theoretical. How do we quantify or enumerate complexity, even if it's imperfect? What is the statistical rigor of conclusions that we can draw from these really complex multidimensional data sets? And on the analytical side, how do we deconvolve if something complex has happened? How do we deconvolve intermediates and outputs? How can we reconcile remote versus in situ observations? And how do we integrate all of these different data types coming from different instrumentation? And we'll be debating a lot of these things, mainly as a way for advancing the design and implementation of chemical systems experiments for prebiotic chemistry. And we'll be touching again on all of these as we go through the workshop, so I'm not going to belabor it here. But this is kind of a very top level outline of how we'll proceed over the next 2 days. We have a 3-hour session now, and we'll have another 3-hour session this afternoon, starting with early Earth systems run by Andy Ridgwell and June Korenaga. And our focus on systems chemistry itself within prebiotic chemistry will be run in the afternoon, and has been organized by Nita Sahai and Irene Chen. Picking up tomorrow, we'll pick up more on the complex system side, with me running the network theory part and complex systems theory and statistical analyses by Juan Perez Mercader and Ella Gale. So with that, I think we're just about ready to start, and we'll hand it off to our first. I'm going to stop share. We have about 1 minute before we start. Are there any questions or any thoughts before we get started that anyone would like to bring up, or are we good to go? All right. So at any time, again, just as a bit of logistics, we had initially planned this as a webinar with hand raising and the kind of all of the organization that goes with that. I think in lieu of hand raising, I think feel free to use the chat. It's a wonderful way to organize things without interrupting the talk or the flow of our speakers, who may have very limited time to convey what they want to convey. So let's lean on the chat for questions for now and see how it goes. If we need to change the format, we can do so a little bit later. And so with that, we've designated our first session chairs, Andy Ridgwell and June Korenaga, as co-hosts. And so we hand it off to you. Thank you very much.
Hi. Well, good morning. Let me just get this. Oh, what's that? Control. Oh, there we go. Good morning. It's a real honor to kick this off. Until I realized it was 6 a.m. in the morning. But it's definitely an honor to do a little introduction before our first two main speakers. There is Stephanie Olson from Purdue University. I would say that she is one of the most exciting outside-the-box thinkers about habitability on the early Earth and also exoplanets. And after Stephanie will be Linda Sohl. She is one of the pioneers of paleoclimate modeling. She was the driver, one of the co-driver of the development of the Rocky 3D Earth system model that's very widely used for early Earth and other planets. And she was also a driver of, I think, unrecognized educational development that was called EdGCM, which was a climate model for use in schools and education. Anyway, so why are we here? Since it's 6 a.m. Because the oceans are just, it's like just a box, right? It has some, inventory of trace metals and there's some flux to the atmosphere, and you need to go do detectability, and maybe there's some interaction with the Earth's crust. But it's pretty simple, and we can just move on. Well, you say, like the ocean surface is a little bit separated from the deep ocean, and the ocean surface is more, better connected with the atmosphere. So maybe we need to think a little bit more about the structure of the ocean. And you think, well, what controls the sort of mixing between the surface and the deep? And that's sort of partly the large scale circulation of the ocean. So we need to now, think about how the ocean circulates. And if you're going to, construct a box model like this, where we need to know what the rates of circulation are, but they're just going to be modern, right? Because, the ocean's the ocean, and how different, could it be on the early Earth? So, how we would, go about trying to, think about, quantify how different could ocean circulation be on the early Earth, of course, is with ocean circulation models. Because the ocean circulation is not described by sort of modern mixing, but it is an emergent property from, the number and position of the continents and rotation rate and whatever was going on in the early Earth. but it still seems, a little bit simple, like water is going to sink at the poles. But then you might think, well, which one? And then you might think, well, how strong is ventilation and circulation going to be? And these things are controlled by all the things about the ocean and the boundary conditions that change through Earth history and differ on other planets. The mean depth of the ocean, the mean salinity, total cratonic area, continental configuration, wind stress, rotation rate, orbital configuration. These all combine together to give the potential for very, very varied modes of ocean circulation, and perhaps with very unexpected consequences for habitability and life. And this is what in a few minutes, our two speakers will address. Stephanie will talk about the importance of planetary rotation rate and obliquity in creating dynamic habitats for marine life using the Earth system model. And then Linda Sohl will illustrate, using a range of different coupled climate model experiments, the relationship between continentality, what is the total cratonic area and their positions, and marine habitat space for young Earth-like worlds. But I just want to spend a few minutes and think a little bit further than the complexity of what is the particular ocean circulation state in the past or in a different planet. And I want to consider, how predictable, even with our best models, is it even stable? Is the chaos in the system? And should you care about it? So these are a little bit postage stamp sized pictures, and I apologize for that. What I'm going to show you is just a few slides of a series of model experiments, very, very idealized. The model is based on a genuine three-dimensional ocean circulation model, but it's run at low resolution. It has very idealized boundary conditions, so we can run it very quickly. What I'm showing you is a configuration. These postage stamps on the left is a visualization of the global circulation. On the right is at the bottom of the ocean, what is the age? What is the idealized age, the age of a water parcel since it last saw the surface? So in the age, you're looking for blue colors are very recently ventilated deep water, and the warmer colors are increasingly old, ventilated deep water. You probably can't make it out. There's a tiny strip of land that goes from the North Pole down to about 30 or 40 south on the very left-hand side of the plot at minus 180 longitude. So for this initial experiment, this is at a cool climate state at low CO2 forcing. Deep water formation is strong from the north, and particularly actually in the northwest corner of this basin. And then it ages towards the south and towards the east. And it sort of has a range of age, not so different from the modern Pacific. So what if we look at a different climate state? So at the bottom is a much, much warmer climate state. And this is interesting because the entire global ocean circulation is flipped around. So now we have strong ventilation and those blue colors for very young, recently ventilated water ages in the Southern Ocean, and then an aging gradient towards the North Pole. So we have a situation where for a cold climate state, we have northern sinking and dominance of ventilation deep ocean, and for a very warm climate state, a southern source. And I'll just note that in the very warm climate state, it's not noticeably less ventilated than the cold climate state. So any idea of a warm early Earth or a warm other planet is necessarily has a stagnant ocean is not correct. So the question is, how does the ocean transition between these two opposite modes of circulation? So we can find at intermediate forcings, greenhouse forcings, a sort of intermediate state. It's sort of it's still slightly northern dominated in terms of ventilation. It's older and less well ventilated than the cold state, but it doesn't yet has achieved the sign of southern sinking in the warm state at the bottom. So a final slide is just showing you what happens in between. And maybe it's easier to follow along on the top right-hand figure. So going from left to right on the top right-hand figure is this warming sequence of experiments, which is the same as going downwards on those left-hand panels. And what the top right-hand figure shows, actually, we ran this model with, like a modern light biogeochemistry just to illustrate how environmental changes, how marine environmental change can occur and how extreme it can be. So what we're showing on the top right-hand figure is benthic oxygen. And at the cold climate state, the ocean is, as you see from the ventilation age, fairly well ventilated. It's fairly well oxygenated. It declines a little as we warm, and you might expect that just from lower solubility of gases. Then we hit this really easy, so regime 2 now is a stable oscillation between a relatively strong northern sinking state and a relatively weak northern sinking state. And you can see that the environmental conditions of the ocean now oscillate between two extremes. We move to a warmer state, we hit position 3. This is that sort of intermediate state, which still is northern sinking dominated. And then, well, I can't say the word hits the fan. We enter a very extreme series of oscillations where if you look at the top of those panels of 4, all that the age is that dark red. So this is a stagnant ocean. This is an ocean that's basically stagnant at depth. There is absolutely no ventilation of the benthic environment. And but that can't persist forever. And it alternates with the bottom of those 2 panel 4s where you see a lot of blues. So a lot of very, very young waters at the bottom of the ocean, and it flushes very vigorously. So it goes through extreme cycles of stagnation, low oxygen, and then vigorous flushing and oxygenation. And then as we move to a warmer state in 5, then it settles down to the stable mode of southern sinking. So really just to say the ocean is not a box. This is obviously just a simple model and just a model. But it does suggest not only might we have a whole range of different possible ocean circulation states in the past, but they may flip drastically and even exhibit extreme oscillations in behavior as a function of small changes in climate, or as I've not shown here, but it's in the Nature paper with a reference at the bottom, just small changes in continental configuration, at least in this model, can flip the ocean between extreme states and into and out of oscillatory regimes. So with that, we'll move on to our first speaker, Stephanie.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy.
Stop share, and with that.
Okay, let's see if I can make this work. All right, so hopefully you are seeing my slides. Okay, so I have been tasked with expanding on this idea that oceans are not simple boxes. Instead, oceans are really dynamic habitats for life that are characterized by significant variability in both space and in time. So as an example, things like light, temperature, and chemical composition will vary both with latitude and depth, as well as season. So only the uppermost regions of the ocean are illuminated. This represents just a few % of the ocean habitat by volume. Likewise, we see sea surface temperatures here in this middle panel, varying dramatically with latitude. We have relatively warm surface waters near the equator and quite cold waters that approach the freezing point at the poles. And now these temperature variations are associated with variations in oxygen availability, because of course oxygen solubility scales with temperature. So we see relatively low surface oxygen concentrations near the equator and relatively high oxygen concentrations near the pole. And that variability is about a factor of 2. And so this variability in terms of the physical environment and the chemical environment has biological consequences. And so that is what I will explore today. So here is the roadmap for my talk. I'm going to start with a quick overview of the physical and chemical structure of Earth's present-day ocean. Then we'll take a look at spatial and temporal variability in oxygen, specifically in Earth's ancient ocean, and discuss the potential role of rotation rate in modulating oxygen distributions. And then I'll conclude by zooming out to exoplanet oceans and talking about scenarios in which we might get even more extreme spatial and temporal variability in the oceans of high obliquity worlds. Okay, so among the most important things to know about Earth's ocean is that it has a vertical structure. And that is simply because the ocean is heated from above. And so we have warm waters comfortably sitting on top of relatively cold, denser water. And so on global average, the ocean is relatively stably stratified with respect to density. The notable exception being at high latitudes where surface waters can get cold and dense enough that they can sink, initiating vertical mixing. And so this density stratification yields chemical stratification. As an example here, I'm showing a typical profile of phosphate in the ocean. And we see that phosphate concentrations are very low near the surface where photosynthesis is actively consuming phosphate and incorporating it into biomass. And then at depth, decomposition of that particulate organic carbon then re-releases nutrients at depth, leading to higher concentrations of phosphate in the dark portions of the ocean. We also see stratification with respect to oxygen. And in particular, we see pronounced oxygen minimums in the subsurface ocean. And this is despite the fact that we live on a very well oxygenated planet. So here near the surface, we have high concentrations of oxygen where photosynthesis is actively producing oxygen. And that is to some extent buffered by gas exchange with the oxygen-rich atmosphere. As we go down in depth, respiration begins to consume lots of oxygen, resulting in this pronounced minimum. But then as you go to even greater depths, you don't see continued exhaustion of oxygen. Oxygen actually starts to rebound. And that's due to the injection of oxygen with deep water formation from those cold oxygen-rich waters at the poles. And so we see significant vertical variability. We see spatial variability with latitude, and we even see interbasin variability here between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Now, we also see temporal variability. So here I'm showing productivity along the y-axis against months throughout the year, advancing along the x-axis. And then each of these colored lines corresponds to different latitude zones. So at low latitudes, we have warm surface waters that are strongly stratified and nutrient poor. And so we actually have relatively low productivity throughout the year with limited temporal variability. The other end member is up at the poles where we have really dramatic variability in light availability, limiting photosynthesis to primarily the summer months. But then at mid-latitudes, we see pronounced blooms of high photosynthetic activity occurring in the spring and then in the fall. And so what's going on there is we're seeing seasonal variability in the depth of the surface wind mix layer. So the depth to which the winds are homogenizing the water column. So in the summer, we have relatively warm surface waters. This results in a strongly stratified system with a shallow mixed layer that is well illuminated, but nutrient poor. At the other extreme in the winter, we have relatively cool surface waters. This results in weaker stratification, deeper wind mixing, and this helps to entrain nutrients that had been lost to depth back up into the wind mix layer where it can support photosynthesis. But of course, during the winter, light is less available. And so it's during the summer to winter transition and the winter to summer transition in the fall and the spring, when we optimize both nutrient and light availability, stimulating those plumes. So here in this figure, this spring bloom reflects the shallowing and increasing illumination of a nutrient-rich mixed layer. And then over here in the fall, we have progressive deepening of the mixed layer, stirring back in nutrients and stimulating a bloom as well. Okay, so we see variability in chemical composition and biological activity today, even though things like oxygen are major components of our atmosphere. And so these effects could be really exaggerated on a low oxygen early Earth, where oxygen is instead behaving as a trace constituent of the ocean and the atmosphere system. And so people will often use phrases like low oxygen early Earth, but I think it's important to emphasize that it's not just early Earth, it's actually the overwhelming majority of Earth's history. So here I'm showing concentrations of oxygen in the atmosphere through time. And it's important to note that this is on a log scale. And so this dramatic increase in atmospheric oxygen here is often referred to as the Great Oxidation Event. But it's actually not that dramatic of an increase in oxygen levels, especially compared to what appears to be a relatively small increase in oxygen here. But in terms of actual moles of oxygen, this smaller increase on the log scale is much bigger. Now, one of the mysteries relating to Earth's oxygenation is that oxygenic photosynthesis apparently dramatically predates this first rise in oxygen about 2.5 billion years ago, perhaps by as much as some 500 million years. And then even after oxygen initially rose, it appears that oxygen levels remained relatively low for another 2 billion years. And we don't totally understand why or what caused this second increase. And so I was interested in understanding the extent to which photosynthetic oxygen could accumulate in the ocean beneath an essentially anoxic atmosphere. And so these are simulations using a biogeochemical model called CGenie. And we've assumed basically present day Earth, except that we've just taken out all of the oxygen from the atmosphere. But nonetheless, we see that oxygen is accumulating in regions of elevated primary productivity. So that's in regions here where we see upwelling driven by wind-driven divergence of surface flows. And at high latitudes where that density stratification is weak. And so oxygen can accumulate here despite the fact that this is an otherwise anoxic planet, because photosynthesis produces oxygen much faster than that oxygen can escape to the overlying atmosphere. So photosynthesis can transform its local environment on a timescale of hours. It's very quick. Whereas sea-air gas exchange equilibrates the surface layers of the ocean with the atmosphere on a timescale closer to a month or so. And then once that oxygen enters the atmosphere, it can participate in really rapid chemistry as a trace gas with a lifetime of only a few hours. And so we can get these oases in the surface ocean that accumulate as oxygen is basically waiting for its turn to enter the atmosphere. And then once it does, it effectively disappears immediately. But because oxygen is essentially only accumulating where photosynthesis is locally occurring, these are limited to the spring and summer months. So here I'm showing annual average oxygen concentrations, but it's important to recognize that oxygen is appearing and disappearing seasonally. And so although these are oxygen levels that, you know, could support simple animal life, the fact that oxygen is appearing and disappearing would likely preclude the development of animal life at this time. Okay, so that's the surface ocean. We see limited oxygenation within the surface ocean in advance of the Great Oxidation Event. So this is the same atmospheric oxygen curve that I showed you a couple of slides ago. I've now added panels illustrating oxygenation status of the surface ocean here, and then below that, the deep ocean. And so oxygenation within the surface ocean predates that of the deep ocean by billions of years. And you'll note over here that there's actually some uncertainty regarding the timing of deep ocean oxygenation and its relationship to atmospheric oxygenation. We have dozens of redox proxies for tracking oxygen in the ancient ocean. And there is significant disagreement and potentially evidence for large spatial and temporal variability of oxygen in the Neoproterozoic. And so this is a problem that we have not yet solved regarding the timing and magnitude of oxygenation events, or you know, if there was one versus many. But one thing that I think is an important contributor is actually rotation rate. So here I'm showing zonal average oxygen profiles on a Proterozoic like world, so a world that has medium atmospheric oxygen. And the difference between the two panels is that the left one corresponds to a planet that has an 18-hour day. So this is a day length that is similar to what Earth experienced around the Great Oxidation Event. And then on the right, I have a simulation with a 24-hour day like we have at present day. And so the primary difference between these two simulations, again, they have the same phosphate, they have the same atmospheric oxygen, they have similar levels of photosynthetic activity in surface waters. But in the 18-hour scenario, we have really limited injection of oxygen into the deep ocean at high latitudes. And as we go to slower rotation and a longer day length, deep water formation and injection of oxygen into the deep ocean increases quite dramatically. And so this is, again, simply the consequence of rotation rate on the large scale ocean circulation, and in particular, deep water formation. And so here is the same simulations, but now we're looking at map views of oxygen in at the seafloor. And so you can see here continental shelves stand out a bit, and they have a better seafloor oxygenation simply by nature of being closer to the atmosphere. But then at high latitudes, the differences between the simulations really pop out. We have oxygen hitching a ride to the seafloor at high latitudes where that density stratification breaks down. And so we've argued that the slowing of Earth's rotation rate through time in response to the evolution of the moon's orbit could drive ocean ventilation, oxygenation of the seafloor, and could potentially be related to the rise of animals here on Earth. This also implies that understanding rotation rate of an exoplanet could be an important constraint on the viability of animal grade complexity on those worlds. Okay, now the final thing that I will discuss is the potential contribution of obliquity and seasonal cycles to temporal and spatial variability within oceans. So obliquity is simply the tilt of a planet on its axis of rotation. So Earth has an obliquity of about 23.4 degrees, but it varies slightly in the recent past. And obliquity is important because it's a first order control on equator to pole contrasts as well as seasonal contrasts. So the tilt of the planet is controlling the relative distribution of light between the equator and the pole. And as the planet orbits its star, each hemisphere will be tilted towards versus away from the star at various points in its orbit, generating seasons. Okay, so here is a figure illustrating both the latitudinal and temporal distribution of stellar energy as a function of obliquity. If we start over here at the left, this is a 0 degree obliquity scenario. We see that stellar energy is greatest at the equator and decreases towards each pole. And because this is a 0 degree obliquity planet, stellar forcing is constant through time. There is no seasonality. As we move to higher obliquities, we start to see temporal variability. But one of the most important consequences of high obliquity is that it actually shifts the distribution of stellar energy towards the poles at the expense of the equator. So at 0 obliquity, the equator gets far more stellar energy than the high latitudes. At 90 degree obliquity, the poles get far more stellar energy than the equator, although that stellar energy is occurring during a very hot summer. And there's a large swath of the planet that experiences darkness in the winter. And then somewhere in the middle, around 54 degrees, so between these two panels here, the distribution of stellar energy across the year is essentially uniform between the equator and the poles. And so this difference in stellar forcing drives very different patterns in sea surface temperature, ocean stratification, and large-scale ocean circulation. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this drives significant spatial and temporal variability in the distribution of primary productivity. In particular, as you go to higher and higher obliquities, you see that photosynthesis actually totally shuts down in the dark winter hemisphere and experiences increasingly intense blooms in the spring. And relatively low productivity through the summer. Now, if we want to look at that a little bit more quantitatively, now I'm showing kind of globally integrated export productivity as a function of obliquity. And despite that dramatic increase in both spatial and temporal variability with increasing obliquity, we actually see significant increase in productivity at the global scale. So between 0 obliquity and 90 degree obliquity, photosynthetic activity increases by a factor of 3, which is pretty significant. And the mechanism driving this is seasonality in density stratification of the ocean, which is allowing enhanced vertical mixing, nutrient replenishment, and these really highly productive spring blooms. So here in the top panel, I'm showing mixed layer depth. And so you can see that, in the summer, the poles get very warm, and so the mixed layer becomes very shallow. But locally, the mixed layer depth can vary by a few orders of magnitude. And in peak, towards the end of winter, the density stratification essentially disappears, allowing vertical mixing essentially to the bottom of the ocean. And so this digs up lots of nutrients to support photosynthesis when light returns in the spring. Okay, so of course this is good for photosynthesis, but you might imagine that this dramatic variability in light and photosynthesis could be quite stressful for animals. So here now I'm showing the dissolved oxygen concentrations within the surface ocean of a Proterozoic-like planet with an obliquity of 90 degrees. So you can see that the spring hemisphere, so the northern hemisphere on the left, southern hemisphere on the right, which is experiencing those photosynthetic blooms, have really high oxygen concentrations, despite the fact that atmospheric oxygen is relatively low. But the opposing hemisphere goes anoxic really quick. And that's because in addition to mixing up nutrients from depth, these waters that are mixing with surface waters are really low oxygen waters. And so we have kind of hemisphere scale transitions between high oxygen and no oxygen that could be very, very stressful for animal life. Even worse, these are pretty poorly ventilated oceans. And that's because we have no persistently cold region of the globe in which there is sustained deep water formation. And even worse, the surface currents actually reverse direction seasonally. And so there is no strong overturning circulation that develops. It is this stratification-driven variability in mixed layer depth that is the primary mechanism by which chemicals are exchanged between the deep ocean and the surface ocean. And so while high obliquity planets could be great for certain types of life, they are probably very bad places to be an animal that requires high levels of oxygen. So I'm particularly excited about high obliquity planets, though, because in addition to supporting larger biospheres that are potentially more detectable, the seasonal mixing actually could favorably influence biospheric detectability by enhancing the efficiency with which biosignatures produced within the ocean interior can actually escape to the atmosphere and affect remotely detectable properties of a planet. So as an example here, this top image is Green Lake in New York. This is a lake that has tons of biogenic sulfide at depth, but this is a stably stratified system. And so that sulfide never gets out. Green Lake is not a source of sulfide to the atmosphere. And so despite the fact that it's being produced in large quantities, it would be a very poor biosignature in this particular situation. A counterexample is the Salton Sea in California. Now, the Salton Sea has a tendency to become anoxic and even sulfidic at depth. And a couple times a year, the winds are actually able to stir up the water column, allowing that sulfide from depth to reach the surface, in this case, resulting in large fish kills. And on some occasions, enough sulfide can enter the atmosphere that it can be smelt hundreds of miles away. And so I did my PhD at the University of California in Riverside, and every once in a while you could smell the sulfide wafting from the Salton Sea. And so just imagine that this is now happening kind of at a hemispheric scale. Again, bad news if you are an animal, but if you're interested in remote biosignatures that we might leverage to recognize exoplanet life, for example, this could be really good news. All right, so I covered a lot of ground, and so I'll just quickly summarize. So I hope that I have convinced you that oceans are dynamic habitats that vary in both space and time. And this variability is really important for shaping the chemical landscape of the ocean and has biological consequences. These effects are not particularly dramatic here on present day Earth, but they could be quite exaggerated on early Earth or on exoplanets. And something that the experiments that I shared showed is that atmospheric oxygen is not necessarily a simple predictor of marine oxygenation. So I showed the example of low oxygen environments developing on present day Earth, despite the fact that we live on an oxygen rich planet. And I showed the opposite scenario of oxygenated environments on an otherwise anoxic Earth as well. I argued that rotation rate can modulate ocean oxygenation through its effects on large scale circulation, and that this might be an important constraint on biospheric progression towards complexity. And I also showed that high obliquity enhances primary productivity, as well as the escape of biosignatures from at depth to the surface. And so both of those things could enhance biospheric detectability. I did not talk about eccentricity today, but eccentricity generates seasonality as well and triggers a very similar biospheric response. And so with that, I will wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Stephanie. It's, in models, adding a biosphere is really nice because it can really highlight the consequences, or how it can highlight how different ocean circulation is and how extremely different modes you can get with, for instance, different rotation rate and obliquity. So our next speaker will concentrate a little bit more on the physics. So Linda Sohl will talk about continentality and ocean circulation and habitability.
Hi, thanks, Andy. All right, let me see if I can get this going here. Okay, great. Okay, so Andy did ask me to talk specifically today about the effects of continentality. So I happen to have some GCM boundary conditions that we could use to begin exploring that particular question. But I wanted to start by pointing out that, we have a rather varied image of what the early Earth should look like in terms of the land-ocean ratio. And you can see a variety of images here. The one on the lower right is actually of Mars, but you get the point. We don't really know. We have zero idea when the oceans became significantly large in volume to begin circulating in a pattern that we would expect similar to today. And we don't know the size of the early continents that were emergent, although the thought is that we started small, and then by about 3 billion years ago, reached most of the current area. So this question of a transition between mostly a land surface planet and a planet with rather more water available on the surface is something that is probably going to happen fairly early on, based on some of the geochemical and mineralogical evidence that has been accumulated. And I have a link on the bottom here to a video by Richard Carlson, who spoke at a PCE 3 workshop a couple of years ago, where he spoke specifically about Hadean dynamics. And he did a great overview of this general topic. But I just want to summarize briefly again, this question of the growth of continental crust through time is clearly very difficult to pin down, as we can see from this particular plot, depending on which model you are using for the mechanisms responsible for continental growth of crust. And when you assume that modern style plate tectonics initiated, we have everything from having nearly the full volume of continental area almost right at the beginning of Earth history, to actually having more early on, and then having less continental area declining through time. Or we start with very small area, and that gradually increases through time. And so, honestly, you can sort of throw your hands up in the air and say, well, all right, so we have our pick of scenarios that we are interested in exploring. So one of the things that I have done is looked at the effects of changing continent area and distribution on ocean circulation and surface climate in general. So these are the various scenarios that we have been exploring. These are very basic. The numbers were pulled out of a hat, from 25 to 75% land, and then smaller proportions of land area that are more or less equivalent to microcontinents, covering 12.5% and 6.25% land. And those last two are also examined in the context of 2 land masses versus 4, just to give us a sense of whether distributing small landmass really makes much of a difference in the outcomes that we have. Now, for these particular runs that I'm going to talk to you about today, I've not made any attempt to impose an early Earth atmosphere or solar luminosity, for that matter, on these simulations, because I wanted to begin with looking at something that was really just focused on the continent distribution and not introducing any of the other forcings that might have come into play. So the various simulations that I have done all have modern solar installation, and they include basically a modern Earth atmosphere. So you can think of this as being similar to modern Earth, but different. So I'm not going to show you results from all of these simulations, because it gets to be a bit much to look at everything after a while, to absorb things. So what I'm going to do is focus on 3 of the scenarios from the 50% land coverage. So that top one, where we have land arranged in 2 continents that are meridionally oriented, not unlike modern Earth in a way, but more land. The middle is a polar cap continent on both ends, so that what we have is ocean confined to the equatorial region. And then the last one is the reverse of that, where we have oceans covering the polar caps, and the equatorial region is land covered. I'm also going to show you then all 4 of the microcontinent scenarios, so that we can consider those. So I want to begin again with this 50% land cover. And one of the things that really sticks out, perhaps not surprisingly, is that for the ocean that is most restricted in the equatorial region, We have surface ocean currents that are really whipping around the globe. In comparison to the meridionally oriented continents, which perhaps not surprisingly, restricts the ability of the ocean to circulate from east to west, except in the polar regions. And so most of what happens between the continents is restricted to gyres, small gyres, not unlike modern Earth in a way, but the relative velocity in these locations is quite reduced compared to the polar region. By the way, the arrows that are shown in each of the maps of the ocean current vectors that I'm going to show you are scaled the same. So the reference vector for all of these is going to be 20 meters per second. The longer the arrow, the faster the velocity. So the scenario where we have polar oceans looks superficially like everything would be swift, you know, superficially, again, it looks that way, but the mean velocity is actually quite reduced compared to our ocean confined to the equatorial regions. So this has some interesting implications, I think, for the temperature distribution that we're going to look at shortly. Moving on to our other microcontinent scenarios, what we see with these is that it's not so much the number of continents that you divide your landmass into, but where you put them. So in the case of the 6.25% land scenario with 2 continents, the extent of those continents doesn't quite enter into the tropical region. And so compared to the equivalent 2-continent scenario with slightly larger landmass, where the land does extend into the equatorial regions, you can see that the ocean is unrestricted in its circulation, and the maximum velocities are quite high, similar to the water belt scenario that we just looked at in the previous slide. So having a little bit of land extending into the tropics really tones things down in terms of the maximum velocity that you have available, which ends up happening in the polar regions only. Similar to the 2-continent meridional scenario with 50% land cover. And what remains for the mid-latitudes is some fairly large gyres that are relatively lower velocity. So the mean velocity for this is a little more than half of the 6.5% land scenario. If we look at the 4-continent scenario, now that we've broken up the land and we have some of the equatorial region that is free for the ocean to circulate in our 12.5% land scenario, we can pick up the max velocity there. It's still not quite as high as the 4-continent, but it allows for some fairly efficient circulation. Probably the closest thing to this in Earth history would have been back when we had the equatorial oceans, basically the Tethys, open for round the globe circulation back in the Mesozoic. So here again, having where you put the land makes a difference. Somewhat less for the 6.25% land, because you're now entering into a realm where the land masses are so small, they're not really impacting very much what's happening on a global scale. And in fact, in some other comparisons that we had done previously with aquaplanet scenarios, the 4-continent, 6.5 land% scenario is almost indistinguishable from an aquaplanet in terms of the effects on global mean temperatures and so forth. So, talking about what this does to surface temperature to begin with, not surprisingly, perhaps, where we have ocean restricted to equatorial regions, where it can't redistribute heat to higher latitudes, and that would be the middle scenario in the 50% land. We get more extreme temperatures, both high and low, and the temperatures over the ocean remain quite warm in comparison to other locations. As you move to the microcontinent scenario, you see that that warm belt expanding outside of the tropics, but the warmest temperatures are slightly more restricted, right? So it has, in those cases, the ocean has room to redistribute heat toward the poles, and it's doing so quite effectively. For the 2-continent meridional configuration, it's actually not that different in terms of the temperature ranges that we're seeing. They're just not the extremes that we have for that middle polar cap continent scenario. And it turns out that polar cap continent scenario is actually the coldest of all of these. So remember, this is modern Earth's insulation and its modern Earth atmosphere, and yet with a polar cap configuration, we have a mean surface temperature that's as low as 1.5 degrees C, so barely above freezing. And that is all due to the effects of not being able to redistribute heat via the oceans toward the polar regions. So, having looked at these for modern Earth rotation, what might happen if we accelerate the speed of rotation and we go to a shorter day length that would be the kind of day that we would expect for early Earth? Well, we know from atmospheric studies and observations of planets like Jupiter that in the atmosphere, the faster the rotation rate, the tighter the Hadley cell is around the equatorial region, and you begin to generate multiple cells between the Hadley cell and the polar cell. Most of the studies that have been done so far have focused specifically on the atmosphere, not surprisingly. But what is it that's going to happen in the oceans? So here, what I'm going to show you next is not an idealized continent configuration, but it's a modern continent configuration because I wanted this to be a little bit more familiar. So, here I've got a map on the upper left that is, typical ocean circulation on the surface for a 24-hour day with modern continents. And again, this is the same vector length for reference, 20 meters per second. And we see the familiar features of really strong equatorial current and the gyres in North Atlantic, South Atlantic, not quite so visible here, but same for the Pacific in the northern and southern hemispheres. When we switch to a 12-hour day, which is about as short a day as we can run with this particular model resolution. So this is a 4x5 resolution. If we wanted to go to shorter days, we'd have to switch to a higher res, and that takes longer. So that wasn't done for this. So, but what we'll see here with this 12-hour day is that in comparison, the circulation seems to be weaker, right? And we can see that directly from the max velocity and the mean velocity for these scenarios. The bottom right is the same as the 12-hour day map above, except that I've changed the vector length so that you can see them more readily. Here, the reference vector length is 10 meters per second. And what you can see now, first of all, is compared to the modern day, that surface circulation is also more tightly constrained, doesn't quite go up to 30 degrees latitude. It's a little bit smaller than that. Before we start producing some gyres, and with this continent configuration, we're actually seeing not too much of a difference in the extratropical regions, at least not as much as we see with the atmosphere. And I would assume that is largely because of the inertia that the ocean has in its circulation patterns and its inability to respond quickly. So we have this more sluggish circulation that would produce, frankly, energy that is more limited to the tropics. And we can see that reflected in the mean surface temperatures. So again, on the upper left, we're seeing a modern Earth pattern. On the right, we're seeing the 12-hour day, and we're seeing more extreme temperatures, both warm and cold. So the polar regions are much colder than modern day Earth, and the tropics are considerably warmer. And so this reflects some of the patterning that we saw with the idealized continents to begin with, but enhanced in this case because of the shorter day length. If we take a look at what's happening in cross-section, this is the top, well, it should be 900 meters for all of them. There's ocean potential temperature at the top and ocean salinity at the bottom. And the profiles superficially don't look all that different, except that you can see in the 12-hour day, the surface ocean temperatures are warmer. And the polar ocean temperatures are correspondingly colder. So this matches what we saw in the surface air temperature. In terms of the ocean salinity, the overturning circulation for the shorter day length is rather weaker. Now, again, this is a 4x5 model, so this is perhaps not the best model to explore the intricacies of this. We would be better off with higher resolution, but 4x5 is the most commonly used resolution for exoplanet simulations, and so I wanted to stay with that. So what we're seeing here is that the overturning circulation is sluggish, which is more or less what we would expect, again, with this reduced ocean circulation strength. So what does this actually mean in the end with respect to continentality? So thinking back to the idealized continent scenarios and the warmth of the more restricted ocean area, that requires more land area. But if we assume that land increases over time, that extra warmth in the equatorial regions for marine habitats would not be available because the land isn't there yet. Conversely, as the planetary system ages and installation increases and can compensate for the heat, it would be great in heating up the larger ocean areas that we would have thought we started with, But in fact, we expect to have more land at that point in time. So we're not actually in sync in terms of the ideal land-ocean ratio for earliest Earth in the Hadean to somewhat later in the Mesoarchean, say, by the time we expect most of the landmass to be available. And so this sets up sort of a tricky scenario for where you might expect the prime environments to be for life. If you feel that life would have been more abundant, free swimming in the oceans, rather than in shallow marine environments, then perhaps even though the temperatures are not as warm, you are better off with the microcontinent scenario. If you're relying on life getting a toehold in coastal marine environments, you would be better off having the greater land area. But again, that's not what we expect to have available early on. So one of the things that we'll be doing going forward is actually going through all the idealized simulations and looking at a range of day lengths to see if there's a tipping point, as it were, at which the length of day doesn't really matter quite so much anymore in terms of the local environments. And we'll also be trying this with a more appropriate atmosphere for the early Earth, because perhaps with the right atmosphere composition, you can compensate for the difficulties that the current set of experiments implies for life in the oceans early on. And so with that, I just want to acknowledge some of my colleagues and our funding sources, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much for that, Linda. And thank you to Stephanie as well. And I hope everyone got something from this about how complicated ocean circulation is, how sensitive it is to many of the boundary conditions that would have changed through time, and would it be radically different than modern on the very early Earth, such as, you know, total cratonic area and continental positions, rotation rates, et cetera, and also, you know, when you go up in biological scale and start thinking about biogeochemical cycles, just how important and how fundamental the details of large-scale ocean circulation are to things like productivity, oxygenation, etc. We're very slightly ahead of schedule, and Stephanie has to give another talk during the scheduled question and answers. So would it be possible to, I don't know how questions work, would it be possible to just have a few minutes if there are any questions for Stephanie?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Does anyone want to, there's one in the chat, but for Linda, or does anyone have a question for Stephanie?
I just had a general question for both of you, and I had put it in the chat. I'm just curious about the biggest difference between when you change these orbital parameters or the configuration parameters, and it's an open-ended question that either of you could bring in on. Are you talking more about changing some of like something about the inherent periodicity or resonance of the Earth system when you're changing these things? Or is it more of a forced kind of periodicity, something coming from outside that can more significantly disrupt either the availability of nutrients or the distribution of, you know, critical redox substrates like oxygen? Just kind of an open-ended question. Thank you.
I can say that in the simulations I showed, I am simply modifying the stellar forcing when I change obliquity. And I'm when you change rotation rate, you change Coriolis parameter, and you change dynamics that way. But I am not explicitly assuming anything about the biological response to those things. That is all emergent from the consequences for nutrient cycles. In terms of resonance, I did not consider that, and I did not do any changes in ocean or in continental configuration, which would also play into that. But it could be fun to think about. I guess Andy's probably the person for that specific part of the question. So I don't know, did I answer your question?
Oh yeah, I think I'm just kind of in thinking about, you know, what makes systems, what can drive systems into places where they have either access to multiple different stable states, or into configurations where they might oscillate or change rapidly from one stable state to another. The kind of inherent resonances, whether they're built into the model explicitly or whether they're an emergent function, can be extremely important for determining where those cutoffs are. And so I'm just intrigued by how the models that both of you have presented can help explore what those stable states are and what their ties to the embedded resonance or cycles might be at different levels.
Yeah, so we've had limited experience with biostability. We've had some scenarios where, you know, you change something slightly and suddenly the entire ocean circulation basically reverses. So in some simulations, you get deep water formation at the South Pole, change salinity by tiny amount, and suddenly deep water formations happening at the North Pole. And so I think it's a fair point that some of these things are extremely sensitive to boundary conditions or initial conditions even. And we don't totally understand it all yet.
And they're going to be highly model dependent as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's very, very early days. I mean, I don't think we realized quite how diverse modes and the existence of stable oscillations. I like 2 years ago, I had no idea that this stuff was possible. And so, you know, we're definitely in exploring mode using simple models just to go through a very wide parameter space. And that's the problem with very complex models. You can't run many runs for very long. And so we're sort of, I think, at the stage of doing the fishing expedition and simple models first, and then use some higher resolution coupled GCMs to follow that on. Linda, there was a very quick question about, does it matter what your seafloor topography assumption is?
Yeah, so it should. But the reality is that we have no idea what seafloor topography would have looked like before 180 million years ago, because the seafloor older than that has all been subducted. And so, you know, what we have used for most of our earlier Earth experiments is a simple bathtub ocean. So a flat floor and a steep continental slope down from the edges of the land masses. That is surely not right. But if you don't actually have plate tectonics that are creating features like mid-ocean ridges and whatnot, it's an interesting question about what actually would be driving seafloor topography. And perhaps the folks who are working on geodynamic models for the evolution of a surface of a planet might be able to provide some input on that based on the kinds of tectonics they assume might be operating, whether it's stagnant lid or you know, active part of the time, or a heat pipe world or something like that, different from modern Earth.
Well, thanks again to both Stephanie and Linda, and it's over to Yun for the second part of the session.
Oh, okay. So I thought that we have a okay, is that the time for?
Yeah, it's time. I think it's time for you.
Because we had a one talk cancel, so we had a kind of last minute schedule change. Did you get the message? You didn't.
You know, my brain is not. You know, you can send me as many messages as you like, and it's whether the data, you know, the bandwidth is low.
Yeah, actually, we're supposed to have like a Q&A, like a 20 minutes Q&A session until 10:30. So we can, if, probably maybe
All right.
Steph may need to leave, but
I
that
was
Yeah.
looking at an older schedule. So, I mean, so then I might say something to that seafloor topography. So
Mhm.
in various GCM experiments of shallower time things, like certainly like the late Permian, maybe there was a paper on the Cretaceous. I mean, presumably in response to reviewer questions, like you've assumed certain, spreading ridges or no spreading ridges. What does it matter if they're different, if there's uncertainty? And so several different ocean GCMs have been used to look at circulation patterns in, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, with different assumptions about ridges. And it, maybe surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, it doesn't really seem to have a large impact on the large scale circulation. It would have an impact if you have restricted basins. So maybe today in the North Atlantic, if you took out the North Atlantic Ridge, or in maybe, or if you mucked around with a Drake Passage, there's certainly, you could find situations where, the topography is restricted and flow might be sensitive. And in those cases, then it would really matter. But in terms of like an aquaplanet, could you put like seamounts and spreading ridges wherever you want and get the same large scale circulation? I suspect the answer is yes.
Yeah, so my question about seafloor topography is that depending on how fast plate tectonics is going on, if you have a faster plate tectonics present day situation, you have a like flatter seafloor topography because things are, because seafloor deepens as it cools, as it ages. So, but this kind of like a large scale change in like a seafloor slope is important for those circulation models or not?
It depends. I think for the modern Pacific, it doesn't matter where you put anything. The Atlantic is narrow, and so that mid-ocean ridge down the middle is somewhat important. I think because of the strength of today's ACC, the circulation around Antarctica, and the fact that there are several gateways it has to go through. Today, exactly where those ridges are and where the gaps of the ridges are important for steering the circulation. But if you had a world that was, had relatively little cratonic area, maybe it's not so important. I mean, geochemically, it's going to be much more interesting, whether you have, a flat ocean that's just accumulating like layers of dust, or whether you have lots of spreading ridges and lots of interaction. Because, if you're spreading ridge, if your ridge top is say 2.5 kilometers, you're doing geochemical interactions, halfway up from, the deep floor. So, and the more spreading ridges, the more geochemical interactions, and it's higher up in the water column, and it's just probably, more important geochemically than physically.
Okay, see, thank you.
So we still got some time.
And I'm just going to ring in. I've posted an updated schedule in the chat as it currently exists. So we had a couple of speakers at the last moment who could not make it for various reasons, and so that's why we've got a slightly revised schedule for this morning, and presumably also for tomorrow afternoon. We're kind of updating it on the fly. So I've put in an updated schedule in the shared chat for everyone if you need to see it for reference. We'll try to get it up on the website as soon as we can as well. Sorry.
So do we have some? That's fine. So do we have some other questions for Stephanie and Linda? Just checking through the chat.
Yeah, actually, I have a quick question for Linda. So Linda, you showed like kind of a few different cases for different content configuration, and the temperature contrast was like a greatest for when you have like a few small continents. But if you don't have any of like, if you get rid of all those continents, what kind of situation do you have?
How do you mean get in all the?
So so I'm just curious, so because do you have like even more temperature variation if you don't have any continent at all, or you have more, or just having a few tiny continent of blocks around makes things more interesting?
So in contrast to an aquaplanet scenario, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So when you have land masses that are small enough and scattered around enough, they don't really impede global circulation very much. So they are the closest to an aquaplanet scenario where there is actually land existing. So if you want land to be poking above the surface, it's easy enough to implement, but you probably won't get something that is significantly different from the aquaplanet scenario. Unless you are putting smaller continents or island arcs or something like that in the equatorial region that are meridionally oriented, because those tend to be sort of a stopper for the fastest currents that you would expect to have otherwise. And so that reduces the global max value and to some extent the global average value for surface ocean velocity. Does it matter too much the temperature? Not quite as much. You really see the biggest temperature contrast when you start blocking heat transport to high latitudes. If you block heat transport to high latitudes, then it's almost game over, unless you're sitting in the tropics directly, and that has pertinence to perhaps not early Earth, but what we think early Mars might have looked like with that northern hemisphere oriented ocean. So whatever incoming energy is coming in the equatorial region in Mars can only go north, which isn't too bad, but it's not focused either, and that's not going to be as much energy early in the solar system history. So I would love to think about there being an ocean on Mars. I just find it really hard to imagine how that would work, given the geometry of where you have land versus ocean, and some of the ideas on the composition of Mars' atmosphere very early on. That's sort of going off on the side, but.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Zach had a question about, I mean, has either of you done experiments where you explored the role or lack of role of geothermal heat input at the bottom of the ocean?
Well, we have started because we have that capability implemented in the model now. We started with modern Earth, and maybe not surprisingly, there's not a huge impact. You do see some warming of the ocean bottom waters adjacent to ridge locations, and especially the Southern Pacific, because that's the highest heat flow region on modern Earth. One of the things I have not yet done, which I plan to do, is explore what that geothermal heat flux might mean for a younger planet. Now, we don't expect the overall flux to be that different once you are beyond the first 100 million years or so of Earth history. By then, a lot of the internal heat has been shed, and you just sort of have a constant flow of energy from the interior after that. But it might be enough to make a difference, especially if there are shallow oceans, if the environment is otherwise colder. That's something that we're definitely planning to explore.
Yeah, so I agree with Linda. We've done some experiments using Genie with inputting a geothermal heat source at the bottom of the ocean. And we've done the present day Proterozoic and Archean Earth scenarios. And for the most part, it does not have a significant effect. And I guess that's because it's orders of magnitude smaller than the stellar heat flux input at the top. The one exception being during snowball Earth. And then that can drive pretty vigorous mixing within the ocean when you basically take away the sun.
Yeah, because otherwise there's no mixing happening really in a snowball ocean, right? It's just so cold, there's not enough contrast to get much
So
going.
I've also found on a snowball Earth, I mean, at least because of the simple physics in the GD model, if the surface air temperature is -50, you'll keep freezing a greater and greater thickness of sea ice almost without limit up until the point at which the freezing point of seawater is lower than -50. So in a scenario where we hit a snowball Earth in GD, the longer you run it, the thicker the sea ice gets, unless you put in we're putting in 100 milliwatts per meter squared. I guess that's a modern like mean geothermal heat input. That actually limits the sea ice thickness to about 100 meters. So i.e. the 100-meter thickness of sea ice, given the temperature difference between about -2 of the seawater and -50 of the air, can, you know, diffuse 100 milliwatts per meter squared of heat. So that's the one time I've really seen it make a difference between limiting the thickness of the sea ice cap on a snowball Earth and it just growing with unlimited whatever.
So that's an interesting difference compared to Rocky 3D, where for the Neoproterozoic, we never get total ice cover. And even for a scenario where we force the model to basically unrealistic conditions to try to get it to freeze over, it does do that, but then sea ice thickness on average is not more than about 8 meters. There are some areas closer to shorelines where, you know, there are ice jams and things pile up to a few hundred meters. But otherwise, our sea ice is significantly thinner than the sea ice that you have found, and that some folks who've worked with 1D models of sea ice thickness have discovered. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. I'm not a sea ice expert. We have been working on revamping that particular routine as well, because the original sea ice routine in GIFS Model E was relatively simple in terms of the formula for creating thickness. What we have now is supposed to be more realistic. But so far, I haven't discovered any trend toward large thicknesses either. So that's a puzzle that still needs to be worked out. You know, why we get such a different result from everyone else. Is it, you know, clearly it's something in our model, but is it simply a parameterization that's done differently, or is there a difference in initial conditions that ultimately drives some of what we see? Hard to know at the moment.
So there was a question about does it matter if the continents are a different composition? And the example was methane ice. So, I mean, does that float? I guess what would a world look like which had floating continents?
Well, methane ice would have to be really cold, because the stability of methane ice is pressure and temperature dependent. So if you have low pressure, the temperature needs to be really low. And, you know, modern Earth, it's really only stable at depth on land and down in the continental slope on the margins. If you wanted it to be stable closer to the surface, I don't know if you'd be talking so much about ocean circulation, because I think everything would be frozen over.
But if you had, I guess if you had like a 10-bar atmosphere and an ocean that's not quite at freezing.
Well, so if you had floating continents, one of the things that we found in our Neoproterozoic snowball experiments, where we have an ice edge that reaches about 30 degrees latitude, is that even though it's relatively thin, again, only a few meters average thickness for that shell, it seems to be enough to inhibit some of the ocean heat transports that would otherwise be headed poleward. And superficially, actually, our Neoproterozoic world looks rather like that 50% polar cap continent scenario. In that case, that's land blocking the heat transports. In our snowball Earth, it's the sea ice that's blocking the heat transports. So if you had floating continents made of some other material, I suppose they could. But if they're subject to moving around, so if it's not like a reasonably solid ice shell for at least part of the planetary cover, and you have just bits and bobs of islands popping around, I don't think it would matter all that much. About as much as pancake ice would, basically.
I think we got time for those. A final question effectively is, how flexible are these models and what they could be applied to? So you've both talked about early Earth, and Stephanie a little bit about exoplanets. The example was Europa or Titan. How far, I know that, models have been applied to, Jupiter and Mars. How far can you push the sort of the physics and capabilities?
Well, so for Rocky 3D, one of the things that's under development by my colleagues is having a very deep ocean of the kind that you expect to find on Europa, with a corresponding ice shell at the surface. So hopefully within the next couple of years or so, they'll be publishing on their results with that, because I know it's still in the development stage. Rocky 3D is pretty flexible because we've already generalized a lot of the code so that it is no longer hard-coded specifically to modern Earth values for certain things. And so they are readily adjustable. But when you start getting into climate regimes that are really different, like thick atmospheres or thick oceans, it's beyond the physics that the model was originally designed for, and then it requires development. So we had hoped to do Titan at one point, but we're not able to at that point in time because Titan's got a hugely thick atmosphere with basically lots of photochemistry happening, and we are close to being able to do some of that kind of photochemistry, but combined with that depth of atmosphere still is not working for us. Hopefully we can do that in the future, but that would require a heavy duty development effort to get there.
And very, very quickly, Stephanie, where are you pushing your modeling to the limits of?
Sure. So on the Rocky 3D front, we've done experiments for a range of obliquities and eccentricities, planet radius, planet mass, atmospheric composition, not so much on the high pressure side of things, like Linda said, aquaplanets versus distributed continents, and Rocky 3D is designed to be flexible. It was literally what it's for. And so we've done all sorts of kind of hypothetical exoplanet scenarios and early Earth scenarios with Rocky 3D. Genie was initially best suited for simulation of Earth in the relatively recent geologic past. I say that being like the Phanerozoic. And into the near-term future. But over the last several years, we've made a lot of modifications. So for example, we've added anaerobic metabolisms for early Earth simulations. My group's modified the equation of state so we can do really salty oceans. We've undone some of the pervasive hard coding of day length so we can change rotation rate, as you saw. We've been experimenting with a version of Genie coupled to the plasma atmospheric GCM, which allowed us to capture seasonal reversal of surface winds and do those high obliquity experiments. And so at the moment, what we're working on is making the calendar more flexible so we can tidally lock planets instead of just changing rotation rate. And we're working on developing different cases for different star types. So this involves changing our parameterizations for surface temperature, our parameterizations for atmospheric chemistry, our parameterizations for, gosh, just about everything, changing light penetration depths in the oceans, surface albedos, and the energy per photon available for photosynthesis. So this is a massive undertaking, but hopefully we're making good progress so far.
All right, thank you. I think that can conclude this first Q&A session.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's see, I'm gonna share my screen first. Okay. Just a moment. Okay, so share screen. Okay, thank you, Andy. So, so this is the start of part 2 of early Earth environment section. And I'm gonna talk briefly about what kind of constraints we have from Hadean dynamics and continental growth. And then gonna follow by 2 in-depth, half an hour long talk by Beth and Bell and Kevin Zahnle. And Beth's gonna talk about capturing the complexity of the Hadean Earth from mineral records. And Kevin, actually, he hasn't given me a talk there, but I'm pretty sure he's gonna talk about early Earth atmosphere. Okay, so as I said, I'd like to briefly talk about how Hadean geodynamics constrains early Earth environment. And I need to remind you that even though we are all trying to understand the Hadean Earth as quantitatively as possible using physics and chemistry, things are still very uncertain because when it comes to the early Earth, we still have a few very basic questions to address, such as, did you have plate tectonics back then? What kind of atmosphere and ocean did you have? Did continents already exist? If so, how much? And how much of continents were above sea level? In all of these questions are still matter of active debate. And this last question about dry land or exposed landmass is particularly important for the origin of life, because as we all know, there are 2 major camps about how life originated on Earth. One is a variant of Darwin's warm little pond speculation, which requires exposed landmass on which the so-called wet-dry cycles can polymerize organic molecules like amino acids to create proteins. The other camp relies on a strong chemical disequilibrium as submarine hydrothermal fields. It's really hard to tell which is more promising at the moment because abiotic synthesis of biomolecules is simply just so hard. But if there was no dry land on the early Earth, then it would categorically reject this warm little pond hypothesis. Now, answering the dry land question is hard because it's not just about how much of continents we had in the past. The emergence of continents above sea level involves almost all components of the Earth system, not just continental crust, but also oceanic crust, and the lithospheric mantle, both ocean and the continental kind, and the ocean volume and tempo of plate tectonics, and they all can vary with time. So to address this exposed landmass problem, you need to be able to specify how each of these components should vary with time. And my group has been working on various aspects of this issue in the last several years, and it's now getting possible to depict a reasonably coherent picture, which I'd like to talk about today. Now, I'd like to start with this one. If you ever read a paper about continental growth, you may have seen a figure like this, and Linder showed a similar figure from Mark Harrison's review paper in 2009. And you see typically many different models have been proposed for continental growth, and they all look very different to each other. But it actually, many of those models are not about continental growth. And this is a very confusing, and we have a very confusing situation for the last 30 years or so. And I wrote a review paper on this issue in 2018. So if you're interested in what have been going on, please read this paper. Today, I don't have time to go over this issue. So just give you an update on this continental growth. So top panel shows recent models for continental growth, which are similar to the classic Armstrong model. And these models indicate that a massive amount of continental crust comparable to the present day situation already existed by the end of Hadean or the early Archean. The bottom panel is a sketch for a likely evolution of ocean volume. The early part is based on a recent work on magma ocean solidification and Hadean geodynamics, and the rest of it is based on our modeling of continental freeboard. Early ocean probably started as very shallow, a few hundred meters, and got quickly deepened by mantle degassing. But after the Hadean, the ocean volume has gradually been decreasing because of regassing by subduction. So in the early Earth, both continental growth and ocean growth could be quite fast, and they are competing to each other. So if we visualize the outcome of this competition, it may look like this. In the early Hadean, the ocean was shallow and we didn't have continents, but we always have ocean islands because of mantle plumes, so we still had a bit of exposed land. By mid-Hadean, however, we could have a substantial amount of exposed land if continental growth outpaces ocean growth. But eventually, ocean growth takes over, and by the late Hadean or the early Archean, most of continents are being submerged, creating the so-called water world, and exposed land is again limited to ocean islands. In case you're wondering why the early ocean was so shallow, it's because of how a magma ocean created by a giant impact solidifies. This figure shows solubility of carbon dioxide and water in magma as a function of atmospheric partial pressure. And as you can see, water is much more soluble than carbon dioxide. As a result, when a magma ocean solidifies, most of carbon remains in the atmosphere. So the early Earth starts with a Venus-like massive carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere, but most of water will be trapped by a solidifying magma ocean. And the only way to release this water in the mantle is degassing by mantle convection, which takes place after magma ocean solidification. And it would take a few 100 million years to degas all water in the mantle to the surface. Now, how a magma ocean solidifies is important for other aspects of Hadean environment. By modeling the details of magma ocean solidification, we found that the very early mantle is likely to have been chemically heterogeneous like this. This is quite different from the kind of mantle we have today, which is mostly chemically homogeneous. Being chemically homogeneous or heterogeneous give rise to very different consequences of mantle melting, as shown by this cartoon. The melting of chemically homogeneous mantle creates thick basaltic crust, as well as thick depleted lithospheric mantle, both of which act to slow down plate tectonics. But things are entirely different with the chemically heterogeneous mantle, and the crust is more ultramafic, lithosphere is thin, and plate tectonics can be very fast. And we quantified this in our most recent work. The left panel shows the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, and the right panel is a corresponding surface temperature. This red dashed line is a case with the kind of mantle we have today. And in this case, sequestration of a massive amount of carbon in the very early atmosphere takes place more than 1 billion years. So the surface temperature remains above 200 degrees Celsius for the first 1 billion years because of the greenhouse effect. But if we had a chemically heterogeneous mantle, you can have rapid plate tectonics, which can sequester carbon dioxide 10 times faster. And with this rapid plate tectonics, the mantle can efficiently degas water to the surface, and it's possible to have a deep ocean by the end of Hadean. The melting of this chemically heterogeneous mantle creates two kinds of crust, high Mg number crust and iron-rich crust. And I'm sorry to show a table in this kind of talk, but I thought it might worth showing some numbers here. As you can see, these two kinds of crust highlighted by red here, both interesting because compared to modern mid-ocean rich basalt highlighted by green here, they are highly enriched in olivine and pyroxenes, being almost ultramafic. And this is important because at the present day mid-ocean rich system, there is a famous hydrothermal field called Lost City. Why it's famous is because it's mostly made of exposed peridotites, producing hydrogen and creating a locally reducing environment, thereby being a very important place to study the origin of life on Earth. And this kind of hydrothermal field is very rare at present, but if we had the chemically heterogeneous mantle, it could be fairly ubiquitous in the seafloor, in the Hadean seafloor. So to wrap up, exposed landmass is likely to have been limited to isolated hotspot volcanoes in the early Hadean and the early Archean, but it could have been substantial in the mid Hadean. And the Hadean hydrothermal environment was probably much more spatially extensive because of faster plate motion and characterized by more ultramafic crustal compression, resulting from the melting of a chemically heterogeneous mantle. And that's it for me. Thank you. And we're gonna move on to, gonna stop sharing. And how can I stop? Yeah, and then move on to Beth.
All right, so if everyone can hear me, I will go ahead and share my screen and get started here. Let's see. Cool. All right, so I am going to be talking today about trying to capture the complexity of the Hadean Earth and what processes were going on with the physical records that we actually have dating from the first few 100 million years of Earth history. And this is the zircons that are found now. So these are zircons that were formed in magmas during the first few 100 million years of Earth history. They've since been eroded out of their original rocks, which have yet to be found on Earth, and are now found in much later sediments. And so what can we actually say about a very complex system, a planet, with these zircons? Because one of the disadvantages of using this single mineral to look at an entire planet and try to figure out, can we say something empirically about the geodynamics, about the surface environment in which prebiotic chemistry or early biosphere would have occurred, is that zircon tends to grow in relatively high temperature environments, either magmas or in metamorphic environments within the crust, and in some limited cases within the upper part of the mantle. So what can it actually tell us about this surface environment in which there was chemistry occurring that is relevant to habitability and to the early Earth? So I hope to impress upon you what we can and can't do with zircon. So I want to start out with a brief overview of dates that we do know about the early solar system and early Earth. So I'm going to be referring to this period called the Hadean, which for the purposes of this talk is going to be anything older than about 4 billion years ago. So oldest solids in the solar system, 4.568 billion years ago. The moon probably formed by about 4.51 billion years ago, and the Earth probably with about similar timing. However, the oldest rock that has yet been identified in the Earth's crust is 4.03 billion years ago, the Acosta gneiss in northern Canada. And so this leaves several 100 million years in which we do not have that rock record where we have sort of the full context of being able to trace different petrological components of the rock And put the geochemistry into more context, we do have examples of this mineral zircon that date from older than 4 billion years. Again, out of the context of their original rocks, but recording a lot of really useful chemistry and petrology that can give us some information about the early crust and hopefully other aspects of the planet, as I'll be able to convince you. So here's an example of, these are not zircons from the Hadean period, but these are more modern zircons. These particular examples are detrital zircons from Southern California. Zircons, as I said, tend to grow in metamorphic or magmatic environments. This one is an example of a nice looking magmatic zircon where you have these sort of concentric growth zones are pretty characteristic. We call that oscillatory zoning. You can also see somewhat altered or metamorphic zoning that's a little bit more chaotic here. So we can have some ideas about how a zircon grew from sort of looking at the zoning within it. After the Hadean, we have the Archean period, which it was from 4 to about 2.5 billion years ago. We do have a sparse rock record, although it is for the large part highly metamorphosed and not as abundant as the more recent rock record. We do know some conditions. We have a pretty good idea that there were oceans because we have things that have been interpreted as marine sediments back to about 3.8 billion years ago. We have mountain building, although the tectonic style is uncertain. And as Jun mentioned in his talk, the timing of onset of plate tectonics, that is still not certain and a very much an open question in the earth sciences. We have a microfossil record back to around 3.5 billion years ago, potential isotopic evidence for life back to 3.8 or 4.1 billion years ago. But again, we have much more information because we have this full rock record in the Archean as opposed to the Hadean. So if we want to extend what we know about the Archean back earlier, closer to the formation of the planet, we have this nice mineral to work with. So I want to briefly talk about how we can recognize a habitable planet. I'm going to break this down into two different categories of information we want to look at. So first, volatiles and what's going on in that surface environment, that interface between the solid Earth and the atmosphere or hydrosphere, and the chemistry that's going on there, because that's really where we're going to be nurturing whatever prebiotic chemistry or biosphere is going on. And we, as a first order control on whether or not there was liquid water, for instance, are the surface temperature and pressure conditions. What was the pressure of the atmosphere and what can we say about its composition? What can we say about this with zircon in particular? I'll try to convince you that we can talk a bit about the redox chemistry of the atmosphere using zircon. What was the composition of this crust that was in contact with the atmosphere and the hydrosphere? Because this is going to be quite relevant for what inorganic nutrients would have been available to nurture any early biosphere or to contribute to early prebiotic chemistry. Now, the solid Earth is going to have some overlap with what crustal compositions were possible, but it can also talk about physical disruptions that might have affected the biosphere or nurtured it. So, for example, how early did we have a stable crust on the Earth, something that wasn't just like isolated packets of solidified material that was going to quickly founder into a magma ocean or to be overturned into the mantle on a quick time scale, thus frying whatever biosphere might have started to grow on it, but to really provide a nice stable platform for early biosphere. One important question that I won't be able to get into much, but when did the Earth develop its geodynamo, which shields the biosphere from a lot of radiation and is very helpful for long-term planetary habitability. Now, meteorite impacts, we have a pretty good idea that during the early solar system, there would have been a lot more impactors flying around. So would these have had a detrimental or potentially a positive effect on an early biosphere? The idea that a large enough meteorite impact might have sterilized the planet, but that smaller impacts might in fact locally have been helpful in setting up sort of a hydrothermal circulation system systems that, for example, extremophiles might have found a very nice environment to live in. And finally, the timing of plate tectonics, which allows for the long-term, large-scale communication between that surface environment and the deep earth, the deep mantle, sort of the outgassing and more particularly the ingassing of oceans, as June was talking about. So some of these questions we can address with the zircon record, and some is a little bit more uncertain. So many of the surface environment, you might be wondering why particularly an igneous mineral might be able to tell us about this. But it turns out that those materials that are altered in the surface environment are going to be remelted back into the igneous record and with some telltale signs. So there are many things we can say. So just for those who are not familiar with zircon, what is it? So it is a zirconium silicate mineral with the formula shown here. And it is a very useful mineral for the earth sciences, particularly for geochronology, because it tends to include a lot of uranium as it crystallizes, but it tends to exclude lead. So uranium decays to lead radioactively, and this allows us to have a very high ratio of that radioactive parent to that radiogenic daughter, and that gives us a very precise geochronometer. And zircon also tends to hold on to a lot of its trace element constituents like uranium and lead and various other relevant species, and not really lose them to diffusion very readily. So what I'm showing you here is a periodic table of the elements that is color-coded in terms of compatibility. So when a geochemist talks about compatibility, I'm saying we have a zircon that's growing in a magma and something that's highly compatible like uranium or hafnium, for instance, is going to tend to preferentially go into the growing zircon rather than staying behind in that magma melt. So you can see, lots of nice radioactive uranium and thorium, hafnium, but not so much a lot of these other transition metals, for instance. So a couple of elements I'm going to point out, in particular, oxygen, a structural component of zircon. We can use stable isotopes of oxygen to talk about the materials that went into forming the magma zircon grew in. Same with hafnium. That's going to talk about sort of the long-term stability of the crust and its growth. Titanium is not very compatible in zircon, but it tends to partition into zircon in such a temperature-dependent manner that it can be used as a crystallization thermometer. And it turns out that's very helpful for telling us about the nature of the magmas that the zircons grew in. So as an outline for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go over the evidence that zircon can give us for conditions in Hadean that affect not only the crust, but potentially the surface and deeper regions of the planet. So first off, very important for habitability in particular, evidence for liquid water as well as dry land. What can we see about crustal residence time and the composition of that crust, the types of lithologies that formed these zircons that we can see evidence for directly in the Hadean record. And then finally, some closing thoughts on how representative the zircon record can be and what are the best strategies to move forward and really better understand the Hadean Earth using zircons and other mineral records. So first off, evidence for Hadean Earth processes and liquid water and dry land. So what I'm showing you here on the x-axis, we have this quantity delta O18. And what this is, we're talking about oxygen stable isotopes. This is the ratio of the stable isotope oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 relative to a standard, which in this case, we're going to use standard mean ocean water. So the operative point of this diagram is that if you have a rock that is in equilibrium with the Earth's mantle, that is, it has erupted as a magma or as a lava or come up into the crust as a magma directly melted from the mantle without the incorporation of any altered materials, particularly materials that have seen the Earth's surface, it comes in a relatively narrow range of delta O18 shown in red here. And the way that you get higher delta O18 values is low temperature interaction of water with rock and the exchange of oxygen between them. And those resulting materials, the rock materials in particular, clays are going to tend to have those higher delta O18 values. And one particular example of this would be the subaerial weathering in the presence of water of igneous rocks to clays to form sediments. So here is the distribution of Hadean zircons from a number of studies that you can see up at the top here. And you can see that the majority of Hadean zircons are actually within that mantle range. However, there is a spreading into this higher delta 018 range here, which suggests some of this low temperature water rock interaction materials being seen as early as 4.3 billion years ago. So for a little bit more on the timing here, now on the y-axis, we're looking at delta 018. On the x-axis, we're looking at the age of individual zircons. And this is all of the zircons that have been looked at from those particular studies. And this is color-coded based on the oxygen isotope spot that was measured was not on cracks versus not entirely clear. So look at the blue data for the most high quality data here. And just putting in some fields here. So mantle values again in red here. And we'll talk more later in this presentation about what I-type and S-type means. But briefly, I-type is granites that are remelts of the igneous crust. And so they include this mantle materials, and they shade a little bit into these supercrustally altered materials. S-type granites are, there's a large component of sediments that are melted into them. And so they have these higher delta 018 values reflective of that. And the earliest zircons that show this above the mantle, resolvably above the mantle value, are a little older than 4.3 billion years ago. But that signal is actually quite consistent up to about 3.8 billion years ago. There's a lot of this material, despite it being in the minority of the zircon population. So this is really a very consistent signal through the Hadean. Interestingly, it winnows a little bit after 3.8 billion years. And that is another interesting story if anybody's interested in talking about that later. So more evidence for liquid water, and this comes from those titanium crystallization temperatures of zircon that I mentioned before. So what I'm showing you here is the Hadean zircons, their distribution in crystallization temperatures using this thermometer. And overall, this is quite low for those who are not familiar with igneous temperatures. The average being here about 680 degrees Celsius requires a large amount of dissolved water in the magmas. There is this higher temperature shoulder here. But for the most part, we're looking at these relatively low temperature magmas. So to keep a magma molten to this low in temperature really requires a lot of dissolved water. So for example, other analog environments on the modern Earth that have been suggested as potential analogs for the Hadean crust. In red, we have Iceland. So these are zircons that are grown in rhyolites in Iceland. So Iceland is this oceanic environment. We're on the mid-Atlantic ridge and also some hotspot involvement. But those do tend to still be relatively higher temperature zircons here, much higher titanium. And in black here is the distribution of zircons that were grown directly in melt sheets formed from bolide impact. So, we can expect there to have been somewhat higher amounts of bolide impacts on the early Earth, but those would most likely have had higher temperatures on average than what we're seeing in those Hadean zircons. So we're going to also have most mafic magmas are going to yield higher temperature zircons. Here's an example from the Duluth gabbro, which is a relatively large gabbro anorthosite complex in the northern United States. And some other examples of sources of water in the crust might have to do with dehydration of either muscovite or biotite over a range of temperatures during progressive metamorphism and heating. And then these lower temperatures may then suggest that there was an extra source of water and it was fluxed with water from some source. So we're going to move now from water to talking more about crustal residence time and what we can really say about the composition of the crust that formed. And I'm going to be using this lutetium-hafnium isotopic system here. So briefly, for those who are not familiar with it, we have lutetium-176 decaying to hafnium-176 with a half-life of about 37 billion years. And we're going to be representing this hafnium isotope ratio. So this radiogenic daughter to this 177 hafnium is a non-radiogenic isotope of hafnium, which is just very useful for doing the ratio. So epsilon hafnium is, by definition, the bulk silicate Earth is 0 here. So that means, by definition, you take the entire Earth in the universe's largest mortar and pestle, grind it up, homogenize it, and that is by definition a 0 epsilon half-dam for that half-dam isotope ratio. So you form your planet, your bulk silicate Earth, nothing happens, and it just sits here at 0. But then, boom, you melt, and you start to form a depleted mantle. The residue left behind has a higher lutetium half-dam ratio because of the chemistry of those melting reactions. It's always a partial melting, so materials are left behind as well as leaving to join the crust. This material that leaves the mantle to join the crust has a lower lutetium half-dam ratio. That means there's less ingrowth of that lutetium or half-dam 176 rather, and it becomes negative in epsilon half-dam over time while the mantle becomes progressively positive. And you can imagine subsequent melting events and then remixing events to homogenize, and it gets more complicated, but this is the basic picture here. So if you look at Hadean zircons, and this is in particular from a location in Western Australia where the vast majority of these Hadean zircons have come from Jack Hills. Now we've got epsilon half-dam again on the y-axis, but we've got individual zircon age on the x-axis. There's a pretty heterogeneous mix of these epsilon half-dam values here. So here's 0 for bulk silicate Earth. We are seeing majority this old radiogenic crust. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to this forbidden region here, which is the solar system initial half-dam isotope ratio, evolved forward in time with no radiogenic end growth. And we do actually have a handful of Hadean zircons that are within error of this ratio, really requiring a very early separation of some reservoir of material that has persisted through much of the Hadean. Although, other things that you can look at here. So we have these different lines here. These are sort of projected evolution in epsilon half-dam versus time of reservoirs of material. The shallower ones are basaltic and the steeper ones are more felsic. So you can imagine a variety of materials. The Hadean half-dam record is permissible of them. Now, half-dam happens to be one of the things that has been looked at multiple Hadean zircon sites. And on the right here, I'm showing zircons from the Barberton Greenstone Belt in South Africa that Nadia Durban has been doing a lot of work on, both in half-dam and oxygen and various trace elements, and also seeing this old unradiogenic crust here, which suggests some long-lived Hadean crustal reservoirs, as well as in oxygen 18, we're seeing down here some materials that have this low temperature water rock interaction signature. So what else we can see from the zircons in terms of the composition of the crust that they formed in is to look at trace elements. And again, I'm looking at work by Nadia Durban from the South African zircons. We're looking at a variety of trace element ratios here. And so a number of years back, Craig Grimes had done some work to look at zircons on the modern Earth in a variety of different tectonomagmatic settings and to find these fields that zircons tend to characteristically fall into, where they form in a subduction zone arc-type magnetism, which looks a lot like modern plate tectonics. Whether they fall into what oceanic zircons look like, and there's really a variety of chemistries that you can see in these zircons. Something similar was done by Turner et al. For looking at the zircons from the Jack Hills site. And then a larger group of the Jack Hills zircons, this was done by a sort of novel method of trying to reconstruct Hadean melt compositions by Tamara Carley. This was just published earlier this year, finding in this case, concluding that these Hadean magmas probably looked a lot like these things that we call TTGs, these large granitoid bodies that we often find in the Archean crust, which require some sort of deeper origins with some garnet or clinopyroxene, which are these sort of high pressure minerals being involved. So moving on to other things we can do with trace elements and also looking at other minerals that themselves are trapped in zircons. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about types of granites that these zircons might have come from. And I want to introduce more of the concept of S and I-type granites, which we talked about before. So I-type granites are remelts of prior igneous crust. They tend to be more oxidized on average. They have common accessory minerals like biotite, which is a black mica, hornblende, sphene, which are these sort of iron magnesium minerals. Here's a nice look at a characteristic I-type granite, these big pink potassium feldspars from dissolved iron 3+ because of the higher oxidation state. They tend to have a lot of magnetite in their iron oxides. And one thing I won't be able to talk about very much in this talk, but because you can find these minerals as characteristic mineral inclusions in zircons, and we do see some of them in Hadean zircons, magnetite in particular being ferromagnetic can give us a way of looking for evidence of Hadean and Archean geodynamos in these zircons. And there's a number of research groups which have been pursuing this, and there's an interesting literature on it. Now, S-type granites or remelts of sediments tend to be more reduced in their chemistry, and that's because organic matter is quite common in sediments throughout much of Earth history. They tend to be paraluminous, which means that their amount of aluminum exceeds their alkalis, and this leads to having very aluminous characteristic minerals like the black biotite mica and the white the black mica biotite and the white mica muscovite characteristically coexisting, and we can find these as mineral inclusions as well. Ilmenite is a more common oxide mineral than magnetite, and these are all things that we can be looking for in zircons. Evidence for this more reduced chemistry, evidence for this luminosity and various trace element ratios that have been developed by different groups. Dustin Trail, Anthony Burnham, and so forth have been looking at various ways to look at luminosity. And what are other indicators of this, though? So looking at, for example, mineral inclusions, and by this I mean other crystals of minerals that have been trapped by the zircon as it rose in the melt. Here's an example here. This is one of the zircons from Jack Hills. It's a little bit younger than Hadean. This is a laser ablation pit from an unrelated study, but what you're seeing here, this is a quartz and muscovite mineral inclusion. Red is quartz, black is muscovite, trapped within this larger zircon crystal. And in fact, quartz and muscovite are the most common mineral inclusions we see trapped in these zircons. This was established by Michelle Hopkins a number of years ago. We also see some biotite and apatite, which is interesting as a calcium phosphate mineral and the major source of phosphate for biochemistry on Earth today. And one of the other interesting things that Michelle was able to do was to use the chemistry of the muscovite inclusions in these Hadean zircons to be able to infer the pressure at which they formed, and thus the PT conditions of the Hadean lithosphere. And there's a very interesting set of papers that she's written on this, if anyone wants to look those up. So talking more about redox, we want to talk about, so these are the rare earth elements that we're seeing here. These are sort of typical zircon patterns. Most rare earth elements are trivalent, but cerium also has a 4+ oxidation state, which is much more compatible in zircon. So a more oxidized magma yields much higher cerium zircons, and this has been calibrated by Dustin Trail and various others to say, okay, this is a way that we can look at the possible oxygen fugacity, the redox state of magmas from which zircons grew, and that's what we're looking at here on the y-axis, 0 being the modern day upper mantle, and we have individual zircon age. Again, these are Jack Hills zircons. On the x-axis, you can see a wide variety of these redox states, on average in the range of the modern day upper mantle, things that look more like I-type granites, things that look more like S-type granites throughout the Hadean up to about 3.8 billion years ago. But one thing that's very interesting here is to think about the redox state of the upper mantle to the extent to which you can reconstruct this from these crustal materials, these zircons, and this could have major implications for the redox of the outgassed volcanic outgassing that is going to go to form the Hadean atmosphere. So briefly on other source rock proxies, we can use biotite, for example, we have overlapping fields of chemistry for para-alkaline, para-luminous, and metaluminous. This just has to do with the aluminum to alkali ratio of different magmas. Biotite, again, is that black mica, which can be tracked as mineral inclusions in Hadean zircons. You can get an idea of more oxidized or more reduced chemistry. These are 3 biotite inclusions trapped in Hadean zircons, and you can see one of them is showing this signature for reduced paraluminous chemistry, looking more like modern S-type granites, and is so this is one of the pieces of evidence we can look at with zircons. So future direction. So this is a map of the sites on Earth at which at least one zircon older than 4 billion years has been found. We've been focusing mostly on the Jack Hills and also a little bit on the Barberton Greenstone belt here. Now there's a, mostly one or a handful of Hadean zircons that have been found at most of these sites, an exception being the Singbum Craton, where enough zircon has been found that's Hadean in age to really get a good idea of the hafnium isotope chemistry, and again, get an idea of that crustal evolution and crustal residence time. So what can we do if we are able to really develop these other sites and find a much larger amount of Hadean material? Well, first off, we are, looking at a limited amount of material. So how representative of a view can we really get of a whole planet, not to mention the crust, of the Hadean Earth? So thorough chemical characterization of the zircons at these other Hadean sites is really going to be crucial, I think, for getting an idea of the heterogeneity of the Hadean crust and the processes we can infer for that crust, that surface environment, and potentially tectonomagnetic settings, and looking at the lithosphere. Continued development on proxies and modern zircons for what all can we say for the types of granites and not granites. Maybe what does a zircon grown in a basalt look like, and how well can we really identify that? And what are the other relevant mineral records we can start to develop here? We can look at inclusions in these Hadean zircons and their chemistry, as Michelle Hopkins did, to try and get at the geobarometry of these early materials, or to look more at their magnet chemistry. Or are there other geochronometers that we could be looking for in these ancient sediments to get an alternative view of what the early Earth might have looked like? One possible geochronometer would be bdelliite, which is a zirconium mineral that tends to form more in mafic magmas and lavas. But I'll leave you there. I want to acknowledge my collaborators and our funding sources for various phases of this project over the years, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we are going to have a 20 minutes Q&A session after Kevin's talk. So let's move on to Kevin. Could you share your slides? Great. I think you need to share in a different mode. We are seeing like a presentation mode. Oh, that's good. Yeah, thank you. But I don't hear you. Can you unmute? Hello. I think you need, okay, you need, oh, you are.
Okay,
unmuted.
now am
Okay.
I unmuted?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, good.
gross incompetence on my part. Okay. Now it has all this junk up on top of the screen. Are you seeing that? All this screen share junk?
No.
How do I get that off my screen? Okay, I'll put it over here. Okay.
I think it's okay. We're just seeing your slide now. I think
Yeah. I was sort of battling there because I haven't done this in a while. The big clock, a hydrogen hourglass, if you prefer, a kind of a big picture of the Hadean and the whole course of Earth history. The Hadean is way back there when life starts before 4 billion or before 3.8 billion, depending on which definition you use. I think the official definition is 4.0000, etc. Exactly 4 billion years ago. Moon forming impacts around 4.4 billion years. So you have about 400 million years in there with a few zircons and not many other rocks at all. And that's apparently, as best we can figure, the time when life starts. So this time on Earth's history where we really know very little is the most interesting to those of us who have descended from organisms that appeared in the Hadean. Impacts were a major factor on early Earth. You can see from the face of the moon that there were lots and lots of craters at that time, and they would have been happening on Earth as well. And they mostly affect the surface. They're superficial for the most part. They make craters, they stir stuff around, they change the chemistry. And because they're on the surface, they're interacting with the place where we think life was. So they have a bigger importance than the pure energy that they provide you would seem to think should be. I mean, it's the small energy compared to, say, the geological forces of the Hadean. Then we march through Earth's history here. I have a driver on the outside that I was attempting to convince Microsoft to make look pretty, and Microsoft refused under all circumstances to do that. So I went with big fonts and small fonts. Hydrogen escape is a general driving force in Earth's history, and it leads to the atmosphere and then the crust and then finally the mantle to become more oxidized over time. So the earliest Earth will have been on net less oxidized than it is now. Hydrogen escape would have been bigger in the Hadean and the Archean. We even have evidence now that it was bigger because we have explanations for why xenon, of all elements, the heaviest of the rare gases, xenon escaped from Earth. And it can only do so as an ion, and it can only do so if dragged off by hydrogen. So you can infer the hydrogen content of the atmosphere in the Archean and the Hadean, and was often as much as 1%, maybe more. So there was significant hydrogen early on in Earth's history. As time goes on, the hydrogen escape rate weakens and the system becomes more and more oxidized. So in the Archean, we have an anoxic atmosphere, anaerobic life. We have this indicator called mass-independent fractionation of sulfur isotopes that tells you that the atmosphere was reduced. We have a change roughly coincident with global ice ages. These would be the Paleoproterozoic ice ages, sometimes called the Snowball Earth by Joe Kirschvink. And at that time, oxygen appears. And we now have an oxic atmosphere with aerobic metabolisms throughout the Proterozoic. There should be enough ozone throughout the Proterozoic for a UV shield, which makes the surface more conducive to development of more complicated life forms. And then there's another change, again, punctuated by a couple of ice ages, and we get into the metazoa and trilobites and humans and other things that infest the Earth. The future is included here. Lithozoic is my shorthand for the computer world. Cosmozoic is my shorthand for where we're going. And then at some point, the Earth becomes uninhabitable. You probably heard about sulfate shields as a stopgap measure to keep the Earth habitable as the sun brightens. So that's my overall story. And I want to focus your attention on hydrogen escape. I won't be talking about it again, so I want to talk about it now. It's a driver on evolution. As the hydrogen escapes and the system becomes more oxidized, life is adapting to that. And oxygen, as you know, is the better fuel. You're not an anaerobic life. Anaerobic world is not going to be very complicated. You're not going to have spaceships and Elon Musk. You need aerobes to have things like that. And so the constant loss of hydrogen, the constant drive towards more oxidized and more oxic conditions provides a bias to evolution that leads you to the use of O2 and a more powerful, more ramified, and more elaborate life form and life system. Let's see, what do I do to make it move? We'll try that. I have a lot of slides here, so we're not going to cover them all, of course, but we'll talk a bit about some of this stuff. Benner's paradox is what I want to open up with. I'm not going to talk about the late Meniere much at all, but I do care about it. No time to do the subject justice. I will mention impact degassing and quenching. These are things of interest to me right now, and I think they will be interesting to you. I will not talk about mineral buffers. Mineral buffers are also interesting, but there's no time for that. Impact processing of pre-existing atmospheres. This is the main thing we will talk about today, particularly the creation and photochemical evolution of reduced atmospheres that are created by impacts. We'll recap things, and then I will avoid answering your questions. So since Haldane and Oparin, most students of the material origin of life have stressed the need for a reduced atmosphere containing hydrogen, methane, and especially either ammonia or, even the best of all, hydrogen cyanide. They need nitriles, our theorists do. And the atmosphere is the only plausible source of nitriles. What are nitriles? They're like CN bond things. This is called cyanamide. This is currently the compound of choice. You also need it to make IKEA's melamine. So if you ever go to IKEA, you're looking at a place where those Billy bookcases depend on cyanamide to exist. Cyanamide is just an amine on a CN. Jerry Joyce points out that cyanamide reacts especially rapidly with ribose to form a stable bicyclic adduct. Now, I don't know exactly what this means, but it sounds very promising. Furthermore, when employing a racemic mixture of D and L ribose, enantiomerically twin crystals are formed that contain discrete homochiral domains. You've all heard about chirality as a quality of life. It is interesting to see it emerge spontaneously here through the use of cyanamide. Another compound that's used a lot in these prebiotic syntheses, and this all pictures is the RNA world, which is the current favorite story. Acetonitrile, CH3 on a CN, and there's some other examples of nitriles involved. There's CN bonds with stuff on them. Nitriles are made in N2 methane atmospheres. You see them on Titan. You see them a lot. Here's acrylonitrile, also called vinyl cyanide. It's got a vinyl stuck on a cyanide. You got propionitrile, or ethyl cyanide if you'd like, but you got an ethyl group stuck on a cyanide. And again, there it is. Cyanoacetylene, that's an H, that's a C2H stuck on a cyanide. Then you got acetonitrile, which is a methyl on a cyanide. So people have seen these things, they exist. Cyanamide itself, the one I'm most interested in, and we're all most interested in because that's the popular one right now, it's not volatile. It's a refractory, it melts at 104 centigrade or something like that. And so it's not at all volatile. So you're not going to see it in the Titan atmosphere, even if it's made. And it probably is. There is a compound with a CH2 stuck on an N2 that's called diazomethane. And you may have heard of it. It's not related to cyanamide, and it's not possible to get from cyanamide to get from this thing to that thing as far as it's known. What made that interesting is that this thing is really easy to make in photochemistry. So there may still be found a path to get from this to this. The geologists don't like that atmosphere. They have, for nearly as long, argued that any atmosphere exhaled from Earth's mantle would be mostly made of water, CO2, and nitrogen. good old dinitrogen, good old carbon dioxide, water. Urey, who started our field and is the origin of all of the thinking we're going through right now, he sided with Oparin. He thought that Oparin's arguments were right and Poole's arguments were wrong. He argued that a story of Earth's formation must account for the origin of life on Earth. Now, I think that's pretty obvious, but not all geologists seem to think that. Geologists have dug in. The current idea is for ferrous iron to disproportionate under high pressure to metal and to ferric iron. The ferric iron is left in the mantle, the metallic iron goes to the core, leaving your mantle of an Earth-sized planet oxidized and iron depleted. And there's several papers on this. The consequence of this is that the mantle would be at the QFM buffer or something like that. It would be relatively oxidized, and the gases you pull out of it would be oxidized. So we know now, well, we think we know that the atmosphere must have been reduced because we need nitriles to be here to talk about it. We know that the atmosphere must have been oxidized because the mantle was oxidized. We have a paradox. At this point, Steve Benner will quote Niels Bohr here. And now we have some hope of making progress because we've identified a paradox. We've identified a place where we don't know something and that progress needs to be made at that particular place. It's fighting me here. Okay, so impacts deliver reduced matter, much of it to the surface. In the big redox picture, I didn't define redox. I trust you know what redox is. If you don't know what it is, think of reduced as hydrogen rich, think of oxidized as oxygen rich, and think of redox as describing the state between all hydrogen rich and oxygen rich you are. So it's a popular word in this business. Volcanic gases full of water, CO2, sulfur dioxide, all these oxidized things. A subduction may pull down preferentially oxidized iron. That would be good for the surface to make it more reduced, but it may all pull down things which are oxidized and which would make the surface less reduced. So what subduction does, I think, is uncertain. Continents will tend to be oxidized. In the mantle, you've got this disproportionation going on. So the only real source of reducing power will be through impacts, which are reduced. They tend to be full of iron. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to use this external source of iron. That such objects fell on the moon and Earth at the terminal stage of their formation, I regard as certain. And it is difficult in this subject to be certain about anything, said Harold Urey in 1952. The objects contain metallic iron, nickel alloy, silicates, graphite, iron carbide. These materials would have fallen through the atmosphere in the form of iron and silicate rains and would have reacted with the atmosphere and hydrosphere in the process. That is the approach we're pursuing. Impact degassing uses the reducing power of impacting bodies to reduce the volatiles in that same impacting body. You'll see several papers on this topic. It was addressed by Schaefer and Fegley in a series of studies beginning in 2007. Also, Hashimoto, Abe, and Tsujita did it in 2007. Here I've scribbled over a screenshot from Schaefer and Fegley from 2017. They have computed gas pressures here. You see methane, we're going to be interested in that one. That's the one we really want here. And then what they do is they take this type of carbonaceous chondrite and they vaporize it. Then they equilibrate it with itself. And that would be with the mineral buffers from which this thing is made. And then they've done it for two different kinds of objects. And they've mixed them. So I'm not even showing that, but it just says 10% of this carbonaceous chondrite and 90% of a high iron kind of meteorite, a different kind of meteorite. And these are computed gas compositions at a bar. Solid curves are the equilibrium composition of these two things mixed. And then the dashed is something else they did. I don't remember the details, but that's not important for this purpose. What I want to show you, if I can get it to click, is that at high temperatures, if the chemistry is equilibrating at high temperatures, you get a high quench temperature, 1300 K, you get carbon monoxide. See the carbon monoxide here? You get this stuff. That's not as good. What you want is this stuff. To get that stuff, you need a lower temperature. You need to get the reactions, the chemical reactions, to continue to temperatures as low as 700 K. At 700 K, you get methane. That's what we want. We want methane. We're going to put it in the atmosphere and have it coexist with nitrogen and then process it like is happening on Titan. That's the goal. Now, we are going to look at how these impacts that are coming in, the cosmic materials coming into Earth, are going to interact with the volatiles that are already on the Earth. So we're going to have an ocean already, and we're going to have CO2 already. We're going to bring the impact in and change the CO2 and water into things that are more interesting. The Casting examined this in 1990 with a very early and interesting paper. And he examined a continuous flux of small meteors. This converted the CO2 atmosphere into carbon monoxide, but he could go no further. Genda et al. Considered the reducing power of individual big impacts. That's the direction we're going. Benner et al. Followed that up with the single biggest impact. We have done this for a range of impacts and gases, and we've also addressed the subsequent photochemical evolution of what got made. This is the key here about the late veneer, which is a 1-view graph stub here today. Highly siderophile elements, you may have heard of these. These are things like ruthenium and gold and iridium. These are elements that would want to be in the mantle. I would want to be in the core. They want to be in the core, but they're not all in the core. 0.5% of our highly siderophile elements are actually stranded in the mantle. They shouldn't be there, but they're there. So the overwhelmingly popular and simplest explanation of this is that the iron and the highly siderophile elements accreted late and were stranded in the mantle. Ruthenium isotopes imply that much of this material was enstatite chondritic or metallic and was probably very, very dry. Almost no water comes with this, but lots of volatiles. They have lots of carbon, lots of sulfur, lots of nitrogen, but no water. Does the late veneer actually matter if it brings no water? And the answer is yes, very much so, because it's even better this way, because the veneer delivers reducing power to the oceans. That's what we needed. That's what we didn't have. There is enough iron to reduce 1 to 3 oceans of water to H2 in this 0.5% of Earth's mantle. That's quite a bit of reducing power. And the reaction qualitatively is very simple. Fe plus water goes to FeO plus H2. That's what we want. Fe plus CO2 goes to FeO plus CO. CO is better than CO2. Fe plus water plus CO2 gives us methane. That's the thing we want the most. Here's a computer simulation of this. We have an iron cored body here coming in. We have atmosphere that's kind of made up of stuff that came out of the mantle, which has water and CO2 and nitrogen, maybe some SO2. And then we do our computer simulation. We have an impact. The impact makes the atmosphere very, very hot. And then after the atmosphere cools, it's more reduced. We have hydrogen, we got methane, we got ammonia, maybe. We got all these good stuff, H2S, all the stuff we're wanting. And here's a computed chemistry to give a picture of why these things work. The way it works is that it takes a long time to cool down. And that length of time allows methane to form, because the reactions that make methane from hydrogen and CO2 are chemically inhibited, are kinetically inhibited at low temperature. They don't go fast. And at 700 K, it's pretty cold. So it takes 1,000 years to get the methane to form. But the methane will form if you can get the reaction to occur at 700 K. And that requires time, 1,000 years, 500 bars of water, that helps a lot. High pressure is very good for making methane. I have a better example here of this kind of thing. I will not talk about that now. So we'll go on to the next. The big impacts are best because they evaporate the oceans. That's certainly helps you because it gives you very high pressures, and the high pressures favor methane greatly. And the cooling is slow. So it takes thousands of years to cool to 800K or 700K. The long time and high pressure favor methane and ammonia. Catalysts will help. And the most likely catalyst would be metallic nickel. And the reason is that nickel oxide, nickel does not oxidize easily. It's about as hard to oxidize as ferrous iron. So it could exist through this impact. The nickel that came with the impactor may remain metallic form after the event, and hence potentially be available as a catalyst. And it is effective to make methane out of CO and hydrogen. But methane will happen even if there are no catalysts, if you have thousands of years and hundreds of bars of pressure. Supercritical water does promote oxidation of iron. It's not the most important factor here, but it's worth noting. So as a function of impactor size, this is not going to help you much. Vesta is a 500-kilometer object. These are big impacts. These are not KT level. These are much larger. As the impacts get larger and oceans become evaporated, the potential to make methane increases. And you can end up with significant amounts of methane and significant depletions of CO2 for a very large impact. And always in these events, lots of hydrogen gets made because the reaction of water with the iron is the primary reaction in the system. This is an example of a Vesta-sized body. I used Vesta as the example because it's a good example of a Vesta-sized body. Jun was mentioning earlier this morning that he was thinking about maybe serpentinizing the world. This is the path of maximum optimism. Suppose there were abundant catalysts, or suppose the whole world did serpentinize. Well, the temperature that's relevant is the critical temperature because below that you have oceans. So if you want these things to work, it has to be above the critical point. So I've just set it at the critical temperature and asked what is the chemical composition that you get? And the answer is, even for small impacts, the answer is methane. A lot of methane, not all methane, but a lot of methane. And the reason you get the methane is because you're getting reactions occurring at 650K and you've sped them up by using catalysts. So this is the optimistic approach. But you have to get the reducing power out of something other than the impact. The impact is too small to provide the reducing power to make this methane and hydrogen. You're getting it out of ferrous iron, which you are extracting. You are oxidizing Fe+2 to Fe+3, and it's requiring a depth of iron extraction. Whoa, get back here. A depth of iron extracted in kilometers, so that the circulation of the atmosphere and of the supercritical atmosphere in the crust has to go down about 3 kilometers or so to get the reducing power needed to get the equilibrium products. I have lost track of time, but since I'm happy to talk, I'll keep going. Say a few words about photochemical evolution of transient impact atmospheres. Not too many words, just a few words. Methane photolysis makes organic hazes and tars and nitriles like on Titan. The CO2 in water will oxidize the methane and hydrogen will escape. So these are the things that are happening as the transient atmosphere evolves after the impact occurred. I treat the oceans as an infinite source of water, and we use UV optical depths from Wolf and Toon. After a Vesta type impact, a basic story here is that it takes 1 million years or so to make this transient go away. The methane goes away first, the hydrogen goes away later as it escapes. For a few 100,000 years, the atmosphere is producing organic hazes so that the planet's kind of orange. It's producing hydrogen cyanide. It has high optical depths. And eventually the methane is oxidized with the hydrogen escaping and the methane becoming carbon monoxide, and then eventually carbon dioxide as time goes on. In this case, 45 meters of water escaped to space, or the hydrogen equivalent of 45 meters of water escaped to space. But we'll just do a big one now because it's fun. A review of a transient impact generated atmosphere told as a narrative in 3 frames. Note that this impact is comparable to the largest event on Earth that occurred after the moon formed. That is, Earth probably had such an impact. So why take half measures? Let's take a look at it. Initially, and I left 100 bars in the atmosphere of CO2 in the atmosphere to begin with, because why not? It's a Pluto-sized thing. It's going to be a reduced body. So initially, there is a rock vapor atmosphere that freezes out. The surface temperature is quite high at first, thousands of degrees, and cools to maybe at this point 1500. I want you to note that this is an extremely non-linear time axis. So don't think of this as just marching along. There's like a little linear bit in the middle here, and then these 2 logarithmic parts at each side. Methane starts to appear as the temperature starts to drop. Then there's a short period of time of only well under 100,000 years or so, kind of roughly in that range, where the atmosphere switches in flavor from this gas to a thing filled with organic hazes as the methane continues to build up. This is kind of a hazy, tightly type of thing. There'll be some ammonia there at the time. A lot of the water is steam, but then it starts condensing. So we're going to start condensing the water, and then the water comes into the ocean. The steam leaves the atmosphere as rain. Temperatures are still pretty high for a while because there's so much greenhouse gas, lots of hydrogen, lots of methane, then followed by lots of CO2. And eventually, as June points out, the CO2 has to leave the system. It has to be subducted. It has to go into the crust and into the mantle. And at which point, because the sun is fate, you might expect ice ages following these events. And one of the reasons is that CO2 will react quite quickly, weather these impact ejecta quite quickly compared to typical rocks, because the impact ejecta are so damaged. And this paper was revisited. This is revisited by Kadoya et al. So to recap, ocean vaporizing impacts by ensitite chondrite-like bodies. I didn't tell you why ensitite chondrite-like bodies. I could if you ask. They're affected at making methane and ammonia from CO2 and water because the pressure is high and the cooling time is long. But on the other hand, as you probably have been thinking, why are you talking about this if ocean vaporizing impacts are annihilating any previous progress toward life? So that suggests you only get one shot at a big impact. And that puts Earth in a funny spot. You're getting one roll of the dice. That's my speculation. However, smaller impacts are more survivable, but to make them useful, they need help. You either need abundant catalysts, nickel, iron, metallic nickel is the likeliest, I think, or you need access to the reducing power in crustal ferrous iron, or both. I'm more hopeful about this for the reasons that June mentioned in his talk. So that's what my talk. I'm giving lots of credits here. Keep an eye on Nick Wogan. He's doing much better work on this topic than I did, and it's in progress. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kevin, and also Beth for great talks. So we have before lunchtime we have about 15 minutes of Q&A session. So I don't see any questions on chat, but if we may just wanna unmute yourself and ask question.
I had a question for Beth, and I think you alluded to it in your talk, but what is the significance of any about the both the variance and the data spread itself kind of becoming much more muted as the lead ages go to 3.8, 3.9? Is that an artifact of sampling, or is that indicative of something broader going on in the Earth system?
So yeah, at Jack Hills, the Western Australian site, that is something that we see in the hafnium isotopes. We see it in the oxygen isotopes. There's in the Hadean, there's a big spread. There's a lot of those sort of low temperature, high delta O18 looking signatures, but also there's a small minority that I didn't talk about of what looks like hydrothermal signatures potentially in the oxygen isotopes, but you don't really see that. Everything looks pretty mantle-like after 3.8 billion years ago. This coincides with the hafnium isotopes show evidence for the loss of a lot of Hadean crust and subsequent addition of juvenile crust at about 3.8 to 3.6 billion years ago. So it's possible that some of, I think it's a sampling effect because we have independent evidence for like a hydrosphere on Earth during the early Archean, but I think specifically at Jack Hills, there's been a loss of some of that Hadean crust. So maybe some of that heterogeneity that was local at that time was lost then. But interestingly enough, Nadra Jaban has also shown this same pattern in hafnium isotopes, and I can't recall if it's oxygen isotopes as well, but in the Warburton Greenstone belt, Hadean zircons with 3.8 to 3.6 billion years, you see that a loss of some of that ancient Hadean crust. And work by Annie Bauer has also shown that this is more of a pattern globally. So it's possible that there was sort of a global crustal loss event during this time, but specifically at Jack Hills, I think a lot of that more muted variability in the younger samples is a sampling effect of having lost some of that older crust.
Thank you. We have two people raising hands. So Nita first.
Thank you so much, June. I enjoyed all of your talks, but my question is for Kevin, please. Kevin, can you remind me, I haven't read the paper in a while. Does the model require the entire Vesta or Pluto-sized impact to be an iron-nickel impactor? And if yes, are those, I thought that the rocky impactors are more likely to have been that size than a pure iron-nickel one, or is that not right?
I don't know what is more likely at this point. The reason for the Vesta-sized body was actually assumed to be an enstatite chondrite,
Okay.
Which is also fairly poor choice because most people don't think a body that big would be undifferentiated. However, they can be. We've seen Callisto. We know that Callisto appears to be undifferentiated, the first approximation. And that's a much bigger body. So there's no guarantee that an enstatite chondrite 500 kilometers across was differentiated. It just had to formulate. With that said, the isotopes are what drive us, and the isotopes tell us that we need something that looks like enstatite chondrites or type 1AB metal. And I'll just leave it open to the possibility that it is metal. Iron cores form somehow. Yeah, they are fragments and pieces of iron core are these metallic meteorites. Perhaps there was a big one, but I don't think it's as likely. I think that it's more likely it's a meteor. It's a body with the full complement of elements.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Vladimir. Next. Yep.
Yeah. This is my question to Kevin Zahnle. Hello, Kevin. Thanks for interesting scenario. So my question is about the redox conditions in the first 100 million years. So you said that, yeah, so we had the hydrogen escape mostly, and as evidenced by xenon dragged out, right? So, but we know that the ionization potential for oxygen is comparable to xenon. So basically oxygen also should be also dragged out, and especially due to the ion escape, which is a very efficient process. It happens today every time we have a pretty large solar flare. So the ion escape is more efficient than the non-thermal hydrogen escape. So what would be the explanation for why oxygen didn't escape, together with the hydrogen and xenon?
Okay, a molecular oxygen is the substance that has a similar ionization potential to xenon, not oxygen atoms. So that the reason why xenon escaped stopped when oxygen appeared in the atmosphere is, in our opinion, caused by the appearance of molecular oxygen. Once molecular oxygen is present, xenon will charge exchange with the molecular oxygen, and xenon will no longer be an ion. Our theory, that is our theory. Our theory is that the xenon ions are dragged by protons and by atomic oxygen ions that are escaping hydrothermally in a planetary wind. It is not a non-thermal process. It is a thermal process. That's the theory. That doesn't mean we're right about the theory, but we were able to make the theory work. And that always gives you a lot of confidence. Maybe too much confidence, but confidence that you're not saying something which can't be true, because you can show that it can be true.
Yeah, this question needs to be investigated. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Actually, I have a couple of questions. I mean, one question for each of you. So, this is a kind of technical question, but is there any hope to measure neodymium isotopes for zircon in future?
Let's see. So yeah, neodymium isotopes. So neodymium is quite low in zircon in general. And in the Hadean zircons in particular, I would estimate it's a few parts per million on average. So I would say that if you were going to measure individual zircon neodymium isotope is going to be very difficult. And obviously, if you homogenize them, that's going to be, you're going to get rid of potential interesting information. So I would say that if it were possible to do neodymium isotopes on Hadean materials from the zircons, it would probably be one of the mineral inclusions. And so I guess neodymium can be concentrated by some phosphates, but a lot of the phosphates have been uranium lead dated as being younger, sort of metamorphic ingrowths into cracks or void space in the zircon. So you would need to get a good uranium lead date, say on a monazite, to make sure that it actually is Hadean. And then if there would be enough neodymium in it, I think that might be a possibility. But I think the zircon itself is probably a no-go for that.
But even like, let's say let's say some people with a huge mass spectrum, that it's not, I mean, that's not possible. Even like it's not a technology, it's a technological limit to doing.
That would be, yeah. I mean, unless I'm mistaken, I don't know that you'd be able to get useful isotope ratios from this. I know that this has been tried. I know Caro and others in the mid-2000s did look at neodymium isotopes in Hadean zircons, but I think their signal ended up being really heavily affected by some of those secondary phosphates.
Oh, okay. I see. I got you. Kevin, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question for Robin. I mean, for Beth. Beth, what is the status of plutonium in Hadean zircons? Plutonium has an 80 million year half-life. It should be ideal for your purposes.
Yeah. So you can see the plutogenic xenon in many Hadean zircons, and so that's so Grenville Turner has published on this. This is also part of a yet unpublished chapter from my dissertation. But so trying to figure
I know about
out
that.
Yeah.
I still got one.
To see if the plutonium to uranium ratio potentially correlates with other factors like evidence for water, because uranium is water soluble and plutonium is not. and also if it correlates with evidence for magmatic differentiation, which should also affect plutonium versus uranium, as it does uranium versus thorium. And the long and short of it is there's been some later xenon loss that has sort of obscured some of the earlier signals, but it looks like a lot of it probably, I would guess, is more of a magmatic effect, but again, is obscured by a lot of the later xenon loss.
How does xenon muscle its way out of a zircon?
That's a really good question. And so my guess would be that this occurred, because I don't know what the diffusivity of xenon and zircon is, but I'm going to guess it's quite low. The metamictization of zircon, so the accumulation of radiation damage, makes it much more porous to water and other agents that allows things that normally would be immobile in zircon, like lead, to be kicked out, and also makes it more susceptible to recrystallization. So that would be my guess. That's going to be much more likely than volume diffusion.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I have a question for Kevin. So you said you think that like a big impacts are likely to be differentiated, or you take chance for them to be undifferentiated?
I'm open to undifferentiated because these ensitite chondrites at least come from an undifferentiated body. So if we're going to use those as proxies, a poor choice, but we have nothing else to work with, so we use them. They would be undifferentiated. A differentiated body would be an ensitite achondrite, such as an aubrite, which is the name that's applied to those things. A differentiated body would be more likely to hide its iron, because if you have a core with a mantle, the core is going to go deeper into Earth's mantle and will be harder to interact, to get at it. It will be harder to get that core to be distributed through the oceans. More likely it will embed itself in the mantle. But for a very big impact, like a Pluto-sized impact, I think that core is going straight to our core, and then it doesn't count. It doesn't contribute to our highly siderophile elements in the mantle, and it is not part of that 0.5% of the mantle that we're counting. So it's irrelevant.
Right.
Did you get that point? It's like there could be these stealth impacts, as it were, that occurred that we know nothing about because they had big iron cores that went straight into our core and didn't contribute to the highly siderophile element loading of the mantle.
Yeah. Okay. But the the cosmochemical work on to support the like late Venia being ensitite chondrite, but it doesn't preclude. This cosmochemical stuff by itself doesn't say it should be differentiated or not, right?
Yeah, it has. It doesn't say. It can't say.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it can't say that. There are complications. For a while, for about 3 to 5 years, it was certain that Earth had the same isotopes as ensitite chondrites. That has changed. It is no longer certain. Two things have happened. Selenium isotopes have been identified in the mantle, and the selenium turns out to be carbonaceous chondritic. And that's also apparently a late addition. The other thing that's changed is that the isotope people are now finding that Earth is unique in the solar system. Its rubidium is even more S-process enriched, or R-process depleted, how you want to put it, than even the ensitite chondrites. But this was only early, and this was only in the earliest cratons. So it appears that Earth's earliest continents are made of material that is not otherwise in evidence in the solar system, isotopically, which is interesting and suggestive of even a deeper inner solar system source for Earth than for any of the proxies that we have collected in Antarctica or wherever. That is, it's not really a shock that Earth formed from stuff from deeper in the solar system than what we are sampling, because Earth is made of stuff that was from deeper in the solar system than what we are sampling. But it's interesting that it shows up in the isotope record, and it shows up as a pollutant or a trait of our oldest continents. And that's should be of interest to you particularly.
Yeah, right.
That's right up your alley.
So which paper you're referring to?
This would be this is getting into Fisher Goda 2020 and thereafter, 2020 or 2021.
Okay.
So it's more recent than the than when everybody agreed it was ensitzite chondrites all the way, which was 2017, very 2017-ish, but now we've moved past 2017 and the fashions have moved. What they did is that they've moved Earth. They've changed the composition of the Earth. They did it with molybdenum as well. You may have seen those papers where the composition of molybdenum in Earth was moved so that it's not perfectly aligned with one of the two meteorite classes.
Right.
Yeah, that's the topic I didn't cover, but it's a lot of fun looking at how they've classified meteorites. And if you're a student, it's now easier to understand meteorites than ever before, because it used to be hundreds of different classifications you had to memorize. It was hopeless. Who'd want to do that? But now there are only two. There is the NC and the CC, and you sort them into two piles. Well, I can handle that. Two categories. I can deal with that. And that's kind of like the entry drug to meteorites now, is that there's the slacker's reward is this easy path in, and then you can start getting into the subclasses.
Okay.
But there's like a big picture now that you can work with. It's not just like stamp collecting. So it's more rewarding to study the topic right now, I think, than it had been when I was a student.
Okay.
And for 30 years thereafter, it's like it's now interesting again.
Yeah. That's encouraging. Okay, I think we are just past the noon, so I'm gonna hand it to Zach for general announcement, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much to our speakers and our session organizers for our first session today. We're going to take about an hour-long break. We will come back a few minutes before 1 p.m. Eastern. So we will be making just a couple of housekeeping announcements for the day and getting into our final session for the day, which will be about systems chemistry. And we have a lot of very fascinating and interesting findings to report here. So thank you, June. Thank you for running our session. Thank you, Andy. And we'll see everyone very soon.